either go to the Peace Corps or join FEMA or other government agencies.
To work with youth through music and other forms of art.
Underrepresented or marginalized groups I like to fight for.
I want to really become a principal one day, and I want to start my own school.
I want to be a social worker for immigration.
My career as a paramedic would be a stepping stone to be a medical doctor.
2016 might go down in history as the year that the shortcomings of the criminal justice system became a social media phenomenon. And that's in thanks, at least in part, to the man who defended convicted murderer Stephen Avery, the subject of Netflix's runaway hit, Making a Murderer. Dean Strang has spent over 30 years defending the accused in Wisconsin's courtrooms as a public defender, as the state's first federal defender, as assistant United States attorney, and shareholder in two prominent criminal defense firms, and founder of his own, including Strang Bradley in Madison. He's also, by the way, a terrific writer, and you should check out his excellent biography of Clarence Darrow. So we're delighted that he's here today. Please welcome Dean Strang. Well, so at least half of us in this theatre, I suspect, are hypnotized by Making a Murderer. And before we talk about other things, we have to talk a little bit about Making a Murderer, obviously. So what attracted you to take on Stephen Avery's case?
Well, he was easily the most high-profile, detested person in Wisconsin after he was arrested for a murder. He'd been quite well known for the 2 years before that, after he was exonerated from an earlier wrongful conviction, and he had been embraced by politicians, opinion leaders in the state, and held up as an example of a reason for reform. And so the fall from grace was really very dramatic for Stephen. And I think both Jerry and I saw it as a hard case because the public opinion was so galvanized about it immediately, but also one that just had the compelling elements that you see if you have seen the documentary on Netflix. So it's where we both wanted to be.
Yeah. Well, the great tragedy of Avery's life is very hard in a sense for us to comprehend, because what is it about this man, this family, in this community that caused this calamity to happen twice? Wrongfully accused the first time, and if we're to be, if we think in that way, certainly very questionably convicted the second time. Why was Stephen Avery, do you think, the subject of so much hatred and focus in this community?
Well, his family is sort of clannish in some ways, easily identified as part of an underclass in a rural county that's not all that affluent anyways, where I think in many ways the class distinctions then become even more sharply drawn. So some of it really was about Stephen, and locally I think lingering suspicions about whether he really was innocent of the 1985 case, in spite of irrefutable DNA evidence that not only cleared him, but implicated the actual rapist, or identified the actual rapist. And some of it, was about the family, I think, more broadly.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to imagine that corrupt cops actually planted a key in Avery's bedroom and that bullet in the garage. So however much they hated him. From your time as a defense lawyer, how often does that happen? How often do you encounter suspicious evidence that might have been part of a framing?
Suspicious evidence in the sense of, physical evidence that you wonder whether it was planted there or moved, altered in some way. Not that often. Now, I don't know how often I miss it, but not that often. I think if you look a little bit more broadly about the ways in which police officers can succumb to temptation to augment a case dishonestly. So if you include exaggerated testimony or outright false testimony under oath, deceptive police reports, and that's a much more common phenomenon. I think anyone who works in the criminal justice system down at the case level bumps into that sort of a phenomenon more frequently than probably actual planting of evidence.
So how possible is it that in the case of Stephen Avery, a guilty man was also framed?
I'm sorry, how?
Is it possible with Stephen
Sure.
Avery that a guilty man was
Sure.
framed, that it was still
Absolutely.
bad evidence and planted on a man who actually did it?
You can frame a guilty man just as easily as you can frame an innocent man, and indeed, in some ways, it's more likely. In this sense, I think that it's really an unusual and abandoned act of evil when a police officer sets out to frame someone he knows or believes to be innocent. The real temptation is when the police officer has a hunch or a belief or sort of an anticipation that the person is guilty, and then harbors a fear that he'll somehow escape justice in spite of his guilt. That's where I think the much more common, temptation, or at least the succumbing to the temptation, arises to augment a case dishonestly.
Sure. Well, if Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, his nephew, who's also been convicted, didn't murder Teresa Holbach, I mean, who did? I mean, were there any other suspects in your mind, and have anything happened since this airing of the TV show that has sort of surfaced new clues?
Jerry Budin and I at the time identified 4 other possible suspects we thought, as to whom we thought there was a reasonably strong case that they may have been the actual culprit. That evidence was not allowed by the trial judge. And so I've never named those people, but out of the field of possible third-party culprits, we had narrowed it down to 4.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's very provocative out there, you investigative journalists out there. I was personally really much more moved by the case of Brendan Dassey, the nephew, because, he was 16 years old, severely learning disabled, and neither his mother nor his attorney was present in the interrogations. Do you come across that often, that such a person who was so, had such a low IQ, so mentally challenged, it seemed to be such a clear sort of forced confession? Is that something that you encounter?
Sure. The people who are drawn in and accused in the criminal justice system disproportionately are ill-equipped, impoverished in a number of ways, not just financially, but impoverished intellectually, impoverished as a matter of, their fund of general knowledge, impoverished often emotionally or in terms of the support they've received from the people who should love them. And learning disabilities are very common, both in juvenile justice and in the adult justice system. So the journey that people see Brendan undergoing through Wisconsin's criminal justice system is unfortunately not at all uncommon, and indeed could be transplanted to almost any county or any city in the country.
It's very, very heartbreaking to watch. And what is also heartbreaking to see is how inadequate his lawyer is. And I mean, is it absolutely sort of just a given that a public defender can be this badly equipped to defend someone like Brendan Dassey?
Well, he did not have a public defender, right, in the sense of somebody employed by the Wisconsin State Public Defender, a state employee. He had court-appointed counsel because in Wisconsin and everywhere, if there's an institutional public defender, that agency can't possibly handle all cases. There are conflicts of interest, and there's just staffing shortage. So the slack, if you will, the excess is picked up in Wisconsin and most places by court-appointed counsel. Wisconsin is near the bottom in its compensation for court-appointed counsel. $40 an hour hasn't gone up since 1994, and indeed it's only gone up $5 an hour since 1978. And as I say, we're near the bottom, but not at the bottom, and this is a pervasive problem in United States justice, the undercompensation or underfunding of defense of the indigent, because our courts survive on and thrive on the indigent. You've probably learned that more than 90% of people charged with a crime in this country haven't the money to pay for their own lawyer, let alone the other costs of defending themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Stephen Avery memorably said on a prison phone call, "The poor always lose," and it is a theme again and again that we hear at this summit. Have the odds gotten any better, or is it worse in the 30 years since you've practiced law, that the poor always lose, as you're really saying now, with the whole question of, for instance, bad lawyers because there's no money to pay them?
Honestly, I have not perceived much change, for better or worse. That's depressing, but I really have not perceived much much change at all in the time I've been practicing. Now with court-appointed counsel, what's remarkable is that you get any good lawyers at all working for that money. And it says something for the pro bono tradition of the profession. It says something for the altruism of some of the people doing that work, that they're doing it today in 2016 for the same $40 an hour that they would have made 22 years ago during the same case.
That's really stunning. So why do you think the prosecutors are so unwilling to admit wrongful convictions? You know, Brian Stevenson talks about a system that prioritizes finality over fairness. How does that culture get changed, that there is a much more propulsive sort of instinct to just like close this case than there is to deliver fairness in the case?
Well, the finality really is a problem. It enjoys near primacy, I think, as a value in our system and needs to be demoted in the hierarchy of values. And there's no question, I think, quite understandably, just as a human matter, that police and prosecutors get invested in the correctness of the outcome. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to lock up an innocent person. And so I think there becomes an enormous personal need to believe that you got it right, that you've not done a horrible injustice to somebody if, a lengthy prison term or even a short jail term is imposed. We also have an adversarial system, and lawyers want to win. We all want to win. And it's easy to say at a forum or, in a public speaking opportunity, it's easy for a prosecutor to say, well, of course, doing justice is my first obligation, and I try to honor that. But day to day, in the scrum of a courtroom, with the 40 cases that this prosecutor will see called this morning and another 40 this afternoon, that can get lost. And I think that there's a cynicism, too, that infects almost everyone in the criminal justice system, where guilt is seen only in shades of gray, and the hypothesis of innocence is very easily forgotten.
Well, how do we make it more acceptable, then, to speak of redemption in our justice system? How do we change that culture?
I think it starts with humility. For myself, I think it starts with exactly that, sort of recognizing that every one of these institutions that together compose the criminal justice system are themselves made up only of human beings. All of us flawed, all of us broken, and the system will reflect our flaws and our brokenness. It's inevitable. And so I think we need to have the humility to recognize that and to try to correct serious mistakes whenever we may discover them. And that's where the near primacy of finality becomes such a barrier, and I think a propagator of injustice in our system, because it often takes a long time for a mistake to emerge and for the actors in the system to gather the will to correct the mistake, acknowledge the wrong.
And spend the money as well.
Spend the money. There's a lot of blaming that goes on as well that's not very helpful. If you want people to acknowledge an error or mistake, the focus then on blaming somebody for the mistake rather than correcting the mistake in the first instance, I think itself becomes a barrier.
We've seen a lot of good things happening in criminal justice reform in the last 12 months. What are 3 things that, if you were able to fix them right now, you would say are the priorities to change and fix in the criminal justice system as it's broken now?
Well, I'll tell you where I would start, and it's only a starting point, but it is where I'd start. Let's stop arrogating the godlike power to put people to death in our criminal justice system. The United States long ago forfeited its opportunity to lead in the area of capital punishment. And at a minimum, though, now, maybe we ought to have the humility to at least follow every developed democracy in the world that has left the death penalty behind, left that brutal past behind, and we haven't. And that would be a good place to exercise some humility and at least to follow, since we've, as I say, lost the opportunity to lead.
Okay, well, that's a big one to change.
And maybe I've excluded number 2 and number 3, but...
That's okay. Okay, so let's get back just to Avery. What hope for Stephen Avery after this? I mean, given what you said about the difficulty in saying, I got it wrong, I mean, even at times when there's DNA evidence, you find that you still can't extricate somebody from prison. Do you think that Stephen Avery could be extricated from prison? Brendan Dassey could now be extricated from prison, given what's gone down?
They're in two very different positions when we come back to Brian Stevenson's thoughts about finality. Stephen Avery's direct appeal and his initial, at least collateral attack, are done. He's not in court, to put it in simple terms. So if there's hope for him, and there is some hope, it would lie, I think, in the area of newly discovered evidence, and that, that may fall in a number of different subcategories, but that's his realistic hope. Brendan Dassey, still, the nephew, is still in federal court on a collateral attack. That case has not been decided at the district court level, so he's in a different position.
Right, well, thank you so much, Dean Strang. It's been an enormous pleasure to have you. We could talk for another half an hour, but I know you have a plane to catch, so thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Today.
Feels like open season on black men in America, and I'm outraged.
The videotaped shooting of a South Carolina man by a police officer has intensified the calls for police officers to wear body cameras at all times.
Undeniable fact that the public trust in the leadership of the department has been shaken.
Officer shot and killed LeGrier, a college student, home for Christmas break.
In this case, my only son is gone, and I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do.
For family members, the thought that Sandra Bland would commit suicide is something they are not willing to accept.
For the family of Bettie Jones, their grief is compounded by her sudden death at the hands of a Chicago police officer.
You have to shoot first and ask questions later. It's ridiculous.
The families are demanding answers. At this point, Chicago police have not explained exactly why the officer fired his weapon.
Disrespect after you had took my son's life, that broke my heart.
Good afternoon, I'm Danny Golds. Joining me on stage right now are 3 panelists who have one tragic thing in common. Geneva Reed-Veal and Sharon Cooper are the mother and sister of Sandra Bland, who was found dead in a jail cell after a routine traffic stop in Texas. Jamal Cole is the nephew of Bettie Jones, who was shot dead by Chicago police in her home the day after Christmas. He is also the founder of My Block, My Hood, My City. Thank you all for joining me. First question, I think we'd all like to know a little bit more about Sandra and about Bettie. So Geneva, if you could tell us a bit about your daughter.
Oh, Sandy, of course, was a 6-foot diva. She was very, very, very bright, very smart, very assertive. Sandy had come to realize that she had a mission, and she was actively engaged in that mission. She was about the rights of people. She was about the rights of the underdog. And so wherever you were, whatever was going on with you, if you weren't being done right, Sandy was going to stick her face in there. And whether it be protest, whether it be grab signatures, she was going to speak out for the underdog.
Sharon?
As her older sister, we are one of 5 girls. She was one of 5 girls, so she was number 4 in the pack. She was just someone who was very, a beautiful girl, very intelligent, and I never missed the opportunity to call her unapologetically confident and assertive, because the last time I checked, in this day and age, as a woman in America, it's okay to be assertive and to speak up for yourself in a world where others do the same. So someone who was more than the mugshot that the world met her as. I often tell people that she was a beloved daughter, she was a sister, she was a friend to many, and an aunt, and dearly missed by so many people 7 months later.
Has there been any updates into the investigation into her death?
The most recent update that we can share with you guys, which is probably what you saw if you didn't allow it to get nestled into the holiday break, is there was a no indictment by the grand jury who was responsible for investigating what happened to her in custody. So there was a decision on December 21st by a Texas grand jury not to indict any of the jailers with regard to any connection to her death. But conversely, the following week, there was a perjury indictment of, I'd like to call him Brian Encinia. He definitely does not deserve the title of officer, as far as I'm concerned. So there was a decision by that very same grand jury to indict him on perjury because he lied about what transpired at the stop and why he essentially removed Sandy from her vehicle, which subsequently led to her being taken into custody.
I want to get back to that, but Jamal, your aunt was known as a pillar of the community. She did work in nonviolence activism. Can you tell us a little bit more about her and what happened to her?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I think that Betty was a mother of 5. You know, Tisha, Toya, Tasha, Tanya, and Run don't have a mom anymore. She was a person that loved church, a person that loved music, a person that loved playing spades, which is what the family was doing the night of Christmas. And she was gunned down by a Chicago police officer the morning after Christmas. The Chicago Police Department has said that this was an accident. Unfortunately, this is nothing new for the Chicago Police Department. They're currently under investigation by the federal justice system. But while that investigation is taking place, I want uncompromising justice, not only for my family, but for the LaGreer family as well. And that's something I don't think is going to happen if the case gets sent to a grand jury.
Sharon, talking about justice, Brian Encinia is facing a misdemeanor charge. I think 1 year in jail is the maximum he faces?
Yes, 1 year in jail with
maybe $4,000 fine.
Yes.
How do you feel about that? I mean, is that, even if he's convicted, does that give you any sense of justice?
No, and it's a fair question for you to ask, and I think what it leaves us in as a family and so many other families is this: it's insulting. It's a slap in the face. You know, what people have to understand is that we by no means want our law enforcement to be held to a different standard than our American citizens. However, people have to understand that when you put on a badge and when you take an oath to serve and protect, that is our expectation of you. And when you fall shy of that, then the consequences that are expunged upon you should fit the crime. In this case, he lied about something that set in motion a number of things that put Sandy in the position that she was in. And so for him to possibly face a year in jail is, it's insulting in the sense that it doesn't bring Sandy back. And for him to face a year in jail as opposed to being responsible for the loss of a life is just not something that is consistent with what transpired.
That's right. And Jamal, your family is filing a lawsuit against the city of Chicago right now. But you said you don't expect there to be any sort of justice.
Yeah, well, I think, like Mr. Bland said, criminal charges against police officers is necessary to create trust and equality within communities. Again, too many times we've seen throughout the country when a police officer chooses to use excessive and deadly force, and then there's ample video support. The prosecutor decides to send the case to a grand jury. It takes about anywhere from a few months to a few years. That quells the public outrage, and ultimately no indictment or no further charges are brought upon the officers. I think that that's an injustice. I think people need to understand the difference between a grand jury and a traditional trial. So in a grand jury, there's no judges, there's no defense attorneys, there's no objections, there's no cross-examinations, and it's done in secrecy to protect the officers. I think the process has repeatedly failed us. In Ferguson, the process has repeatedly failed us in Chicago. And again, criminal charges need to be brought upon officers to establish trust within communities.
Absolutely. And then speaking of establishing trust, I mean, you couldn't find a more blatant example of when police were actually called to create a situation, to diffuse a situation, to make it safe. And this is what happens. I mean, how do you even start to get back that trust?
I think that understanding and leading with empathy, but first of all, just understanding having a police badge either is going to provide you a platform that is going to promote your positivity. If you're a good person, wearing that police badge is going to give you a platform to elevate your good spirit. If you're a bad person, having a police badge is going to give you a platform to elevate your stage for wickedness. And so police officers are not above the law, but they are human beings. So just treat people the way you want to be treated and love before anything.
Geneva, touching on treating people how they want to be treated, what would you say to Brian and Cynthia right now? We know that you were very vocal with, I think it was the Chicago Police Board meeting, when you told them that they were criminalizing the victims, which is a situation we see time and time again in the media when a situation like what happened happens. So what would you say to Brian and Cynthia? I almost say officer, but I'm going to stop myself.
Absolutely. I'm okay with him being called whatever folks want to call him, but he will always be the person who was the impetus to my daughter's death. And so I'm not sure if I'm at a point where I can even be in the same room with the gentleman, but as a mother, and I use that all the time, I would just have to ask, what were you thinking? Honestly, what were you thinking? And when I look at the same tape that the entire world has seen, there is no way I would have treated anyone's child in that manner. And so from a simple warning, we get jail, and then she's gone, I would have to ask the gentleman, what was your issue? Where was your head? And in my mind, as a parent, I don't have that answer. I can't even fathom what he must have been thinking. The stop was over. It was over. And so if you're not able to take care of your aggressive issues that you may have as the person who carries the badge and has the control, maybe you need to have a timeout.
We're talking a lot about how police interact with the community. And I think that's one of the bigger pictures at hand. Obviously, these are two horrific cases. But Jamal, you grew up on the south side of Chicago, a neighborhood that has a reputation for a lot of gun violence and a lot of police presence. How can the police do a better job in these neighborhoods? You know, I used to work in crime reporting, and you go into some bad areas, and residents want police there, a lot of them. They do. They want safer communities. But when you have a situation when you're calling police and where police have a systemic harassment of residents, it pushes people away from law enforcement. So how do you rectify that situation?
Well, I think one of the things that stand out about the west side and south side of Chicago is the overwhelming presence of the criminal justice system within a community. If a teenager lives in East Garfield Park, North Lawndale, or the south side in Chatham, where I stay, seeing a squad car is like a defining social structure of their life. You know, they see them so often. When I jump off the red line, the elevated train in Chicago on 79th, German Shepherds are there sniffing my dogs, sniffing my knees. You know, my daughter at 2 years old, she knew what a helicopter was. So I think that when I think of what can be done in Chicago, I think there's work being done all across the country, and I think that the answers are there. The information is there, and if they truly want to find out solutions, they could survey communities. You know, they could say, how do you want to be policed? They could police the police. There's a few different things that could be done in that regard.
Absolutely.
I'd also like to note, too, that we actually are from Chicago, born and raised, and that's our only Texas connection is Sandy. And so what I would say more than anything, what we've seen as families is we need to see a commitment to transparency from police officers, particularly in cases where there are officers involved in cases that are surrounded and shrouded in misconduct. It is the expectation of the families to be at the forefront, to be vocal, to be outspoken, to share everything that they can about their family member. But then when we're standing at the door or knocking on the door asking for questions, it's closed to us. And so it's very infuriating, even in Betty Jones's case, the fact that they don't have all of the information that they need when there's a clear admission that this was an accidental shooting. Everything should be furnished to them. In Sandy's case, every single piece of paper that had anything to do with her detainment in the field to the time that she was found in custody, expired, should be provided to the family. And so there are these delays, and there was a panelist who said it earlier, there are delays that I personally feel are utilized as stall tactics to make you, get yourself into a situation where you become, despondent or you get discouraged. And so I just want to encourage people, and John Jay Justice College has given me so much courage today to say what I continue to say, is that the pursuit of justice, it is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and it's imperative for you to stay in the race to get to the finish line.
That's right. That's right.
You go first. I want to also just touch on it, that the over-militarization of a community, all these police, at first blush, it appears to be something that is gonna improve safety, but what it is actually it's damaging to your psyche to see that many police. One can make the argument that seeing all the squad cars is damaging to your health. It has a negative impact on education, housing, and employment within a community. So I think we need to start reforming the way we police our communities, maybe having more beat police instead of just squad cars scrambling through the areas.
And I just want to take the opportunity to say, just being an individual who, growing up, remembers seeing on the squad car, serve and protect. I want the people to understand, are we talking about serve and protect, or are we talking about isolate and neglect? Okay? Because that's what's been going on around here. And the biggest part of it is no one's being vocal enough so that movement occurs. So while we're sitting here on this panel and we're going out and we're going state to state, no. Don't just be okay when we're done. And don't just come up and hug me and say, okay, Ms. Reedbill, I feel you. Oh, God, this is great. Do something. And so if it is, I need to say this. Hang on. And so my thing here is, this is a hand. There's 4 fingers and a thumb. They have different things that they do. If the thumb doesn't show up, guess what? The 4 fingers have a problem. Okay? So if you write letters, you do that. If you're a Department of Justice writer, do that. If you go stand in front of somebody's door, do that. Be careful. Do that. But I'm saying it takes a collective, effort to get change done. And even we're in an election year, I'm not concerned about your promises. If you're in a state where you can literally bring a bill to the floor, if you can do something now, show me what you can do now. I'm not talking about what you're going to do in 2017.
You want to see
because people are dying now.
Research has shown, and we look at Sandra's case, you look at places like Ferguson, they've done reports there in the St. Louis municipalities, that African-American drivers are pulled over way more than white drivers. And you were talking about harassment and how it affects people's psyches. How does that affect you when you get behind the wheel of a car?
Are you kidding me? Oh my God. Since Sandy's, issue, if I'm in anyone's car now, I make sure the blinker's being used. I make sure I'm looking in my rear view. I make sure I'm right at the speed limit. And unfortunately, you could do all those things, and you will still, this is my case, be stopped, asked for your items, you present your items, and you're stalled there, okay? So I don't know if there's anything you can do to ward off this treatment, but I tell you what, if you're driving around without your proper paperwork, please go get it. just have it when it's there. Because for me, this is a whole different thing. And as I run into women across the world, they say to me, you know what? Now I look in my rear view. Now I use that blinker. Now Sandy comes to my mind every time I see a squad car. And so for us, we go out and we continue to keep her story out. In July, 7 other women died in police custody. What are their names? You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So we're going to keep speaking. We're going to keep talking about this because it needs to happen. But after the talking, action needs to take place. And each one of us has the power to do it.
Jamal, you work with an organization that you started in My Block, My Hood, My City, where you take a lot of youth in your community around the city. Mm-hmm. What do you tell them about interacting with police?
Well, I tell them to treat people the way they want to be treated. A lot of the teenagers we work with have been in the system. So, but again, My Block, My Hood, My City started from volunteering at the prison. And a lot of teenagers told me they had never been downtown. So their entire worldview was shaped by a few blocks or a few hoods. So seeing this over-militarization of a community, that's how they grew up. To me, it was tragic. They didn't feel a part of something larger outside the radius of a few blocks where they lived. So every week, we give 15 teenagers the opportunity to travel to another area of Chicago. I mean, it's so serious. Some people have never been downtown. Some people have never seen the lake. Lake Michigan. They see Lake Michigan and they say, what ocean is that? So just giving teenagers access to opportunities outside of their block and their community and their hood is what my program is about. And I think that once you expose them to or once they can see success in different forms and you expose them to architects, Microsoft engineers, traders, et cetera, then they're smart enough to say, you know what, I want to be that. I want to learn. These people can be my mentors. How can I connect with them? So really, I'm just providing a platform that gives them access to opportunities.
I think I could listen to all of you for like another hour, but more probably. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So I just want to thank you guys for coming down and talking to us.
Absolutely.
It's incredibly brave for all three of you to stand up here. And I think you've definitely motivated a lot of people here just by hearing the applause constantly throughout the panel. So thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, John Joe.
Yeah, I've got eyes on the back of this truck. Let me know if you need more info.
Box 1, Davis.
Go ahead.
Did you need negotiators also? I believe they're en route. Just need to confirm.
Affirmative.
10-4. Just 10-14, female fathers at the PD.
Hey, just 10-14, you have media here. I'm just staging them where we're at on 100 East State. 701. Got a Farmington police car blocking Main Street and First North. I need them to move that so the ambulance can get through, please. 10-4. Initiate.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Toobin, and we're going to talk about the police, sort of following on to the last panel, and talk about some of the solutions. And let me just start with some numbers for your consideration. 1,138 people were killed by the police in 2015. 965 of them were fatally shot. 235 were unarmed. Young black men were 9 times more likely than other Americans to be killed by law enforcement. On the other side of the equation, 129 police officers were reported killed in the line of duty in 2015. This is a number that includes death by heart attack, automobile accident, and illness. 39 of those officers were killed by gunfire. And so what this panel is really about is to try to address what police and communities can do to reduce both of those numbers. And let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Cedric Alexander currently serves as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the Office of Public Safety in DeKalb County, Georgia. Dr. Alexander began his law enforcement career in 1977, serving as a police officer before moving up to become chief. He currently serves on the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and on the board, and was appointed to President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Brittany Packett, hello Brittany, who also serves on the President's 21st Century Policing Task Force, is the Executive Director of Teach for America in St. Louis. She's an activist within the Black Lives Matter movement, and in 2015, she launched Campaign Zero, a web platform offering policy-driven solutions to end police-involved shootings. Jill Leovy is a fellow journalist. She's with the LA Times, and she founded their Homicide Report as a means of chronicling the victims of murder in South LA. Her critically acclaimed and terrific book, Ghettocide, A True Story of Murder in America, was published last year. And finally, we are joined by Dub Lawrence, a former Utah sheriff who founded his county's first SWAT team back in the 1970s, the SWAT team that 30 years later killed his son-in-law, Brian Wood, in the video you just saw. So, Dub, let me start with you. That is a personal horror story for you, but it's also a policy lesson about how the police deal with situations of an armed person. I mean, Brian was armed. What should have been done differently in that circumstance?
I can only speak to that from my own personal experience. I founded the SWAT team in 1975. I was elected sheriff in 1974, so it was a new thing. In the 60s, I was in the Marine Corps during the Watts riots. A lot of the things were happening that were more violent in the country. But when I left the Marine Corps and became a police officer and then was elected county sheriff, that was something that seemed to be the right thing to do, considering the events of the times. But I had a philosophy. I took an oath as a Marine, I took an oath as a police officer, I took an oath as a county sheriff, and they're all similar. But on my honor, I will do my duty. Excuse me. Back up. I can't believe this.
You don't have to do the oath.
The oath of office that was that I took included, when I swore in my officers as deputies, as sheriff, I can remember the part of the sheriff, but I solemnly swear that I will obey, support, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state and discharge my duty with fidelity. And then I also added the first paragraph of the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics. And it states, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent from deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all persons to liberty, equality, and justice. And that was the philosophy back in the 70s. That's the way we trained our officers. Every SWAT operation the whole effort was to neutralize, to diffuse, to negotiate. If we had had a failed operation, if somebody got hurt or killed, it would have been a failed operation. The changes that have occurred over the last 45 years, those changes have impacted our society tremendously. And when I watched and witnessed my son being shot to death by the police, and then the police actually put over the press for 20 hours that it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. It was the misinformation. It was a practice. There were 46 SWAT officers within 50 feet of him. He was totally contained. There was no reason whatsoever to use deadly force.
So let me just stop you there. Cedric, when you think about you're responsible for outfitting your officers as well as hiring them. One of the striking things about the scene there was the extreme militarization of the process. We certainly saw it in Ferguson. What's your approach to the kind of equipment your police force needs?
Well, first of all, let me put things in a little historical context as it relates to your question. Very long standing in this country, particularly communities of color and police have had this not so good of a relationship, if you will. We also have to own and accept the fact that also in policing, we have done a number of things historically that have oppressed people throughout the history of this nation, going back to the beginning of police departments. So we fast forward up. We all know the history of police and community. Some communities it has been far greater than others, but we know that there are communities that still struggle a great deal with developing those relationships. And if we move fast forward again now to Ferguson, and in Ferguson what we saw was a misuse of specialized weapons and tactics, better known as SWAT, with M4 rifles being pointed down range at American citizens who were just merely exercising their constitutional right. That for us was a unique experience and embarrassment for this entire nation, from the White House right to Main Street. And around the globe, people did not accept that, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives. Nobody liked the idea of American citizens being threatened by the local police for merely exercising their rights. That was a horrible optic that set the tone that the conversation we're having right now as it relates to demilitarization of policing. So we do have to demilitarize, and we cannot use that type of force in any and every incident or event that we may come in contact with. Now, but let's be very realistic as well, because we also live in a time post 9/11 where if you think about San Bernardino, California, where local police had to respond to a threat, a live, active threat. They needed the equipment, they needed the weaponry, and they needed the training, and they also needed the policy that the sheriff talked about that needs to be in place in order to carry out that act. But that is not in each and every call you go to. You don't take, in my opinion, you don't take a SWAT team just because you go into a crack house. That's a little bit over the top. Even though there may be some indications of guns that may be inside, and we understand that, but I think we have to be a lot more conservative in terms of that approach going forward. Because what the American people expect is a police department that is trained to protect them, have all the necessary equipment and resources in order to do so, because that's the time that we live in. We can be in a theater, we can be in a mall, we can just be somewhere minding our business where we want police to be able to respond to rescue us. And to do that, they have to be safe, they have to have the necessary equipment in order to do so. But we cannot, as we saw on this video and many other images we've seen across the country, allow that type of force being used in any and all circumstances.
Brittany, you feel free. Brittany, you see the scenes of the militarization. Is the problem what the cops have or what the cops do?
I would say it's a bit of both, right? And I want to be clear that we're operating in a reality, because the reality is we're not just talking about optics or images, right? We're talking about the fact that myself and several other young women that live in St. Louis are having conversations with our OBGYNs right now, wondering if tear gas is going to have an effect on our reproductive system, right? We're talking about children and wondering if tear gas, and well, not if, how, tear gas, M16s, and the psychological and physical damage that they have endured on the streets of Ferguson and quite frankly on the streets of St. Louis, how that will affect their educational, employment, and college outcomes, right? So I want to just make sure that we are situating this in more than just an image on a screen, because this is real for you, right? I know this is real for everyone up here, and so I want to start off that way. But Dr. Alexander is exactly right in saying that we were out there in Ferguson engaging in our democracy in the way that people tell us to, right? In the way that the great founders of this country did. But when we did it in our black skin with our rap music and our young selves, we were considered threats instead of patriots. And so at the end of the day, it's about what the cops have, it's about what they do, but it's also about how American society draws up young people of color as people to be seen as enemy combatants instead of the full citizens that we are and the respect that we deserve.
Now, Jill, you have written that Black Lives Matter, but also Black Deaths Matter. And you have written about how African Americans are overwhelmingly the victims of the crimes that you have written about in LA. We talk about this this story a lot in the sense of over-policing, too much, but do you suggest that under-policing is also a big part of the problem?
I do. I think one of the things we have to look at when we look at both the number of police officers who die and the number of people who are killed by police in this country is it's part of the big picture, the large context, is that the U.S., relatively speaking, compared to other developed Western nations, is extremely violent, strangely violent, and has been all through its history. It's a very peculiar thing about American history that you see great wealth, you see elaborate development of institutions, as you do in European countries, but you see this very, very high rate of violence. I think that you have to conclude that both deaths at the hands of the police and the death of police officers are part of that overall context of violence. And to say the obvious, we cannot talk about policing without talking about crime. Crime is what police do. And so it always has to be part of the conversation.
But what do you mean by under-policing?
So when you look at the American exception, you say, what is it about America that makes it exceptional? One of the things that stands out is weak policing throughout our history. We have very, very fragmented police. Think about it. Our highest crimes, murder, our state crimes, our law enforcement agencies, our municipal bureaucracies, for the most part, they're different from place to place. I was thinking in Freddie Gray, you know, the paddy wagon was outlawed in LA in about late 70s, early 80s, I think. So you're talking about decades of difference in practice in different police departments around the country. It's a fragmented system, and we have a very strong tradition going all the way back through the 19th century of communal justice, of posse justice in this country. This is cowboy country. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. That is of a piece with very threadbare, very weak law enforcement. And when I say weak, I think sort of the focal point of that weakness is solving crimes. And I use homicide in my book partly because it's the most countable crime and partly because it's the most important crime. Violent crime against persons is a political force. It has to be controlled in a society if there's going to be control. And you see, the John Jay students and professors here can argue with me, but I think you see a very strong pattern of very low rates of solving both homicide and assault going all the way back to the 19th century. And this is a fundamental problem that really we need a lot of research and we need a lot of work on.
Cedric, I know you want to jump in, but I mean, it is a fascinating and little known fact that most homicides, particularly in poorer communities, there are no arrests, there are no prosecutions. I mean, they just don't get, these cases don't get solved.
That's right, and violence is different. Violence is a very, very particular thing. If you do not have a state monopoly on violence, it is dispersed, and you have violence elsewhere. And what was so gripping to me about researching Ghettocide is to see the similarities between South Central, Northern Ireland, South Africa, favelas of Brazil. They all tend to have similar traits, these environments. They're rumor-rich, there's communal justice. It's very clear that there's underlying forces.
Cedric, you wanted to
Yeah, let me speak from the position of an active duty police administrator. The juxtaposition here that both police and community is in many communities that are very much challenged. Whether they're challenged by socioeconomic conditions, poor education, whatever the case may happen to be, we have them throughout our communities, throughout this country. So that being the community, those are the communities oftentimes that require and call for the most police service. That is a data-driven fact. And in those communities where you have those challenges, where you may be challenged by violence, by gang activity, or wannabe gang activities, or murders, or homicides, or whatever the case may happen to be, these are the calls for service most police departments are going to respond to first. This is where they're probably going to put the greatest amount of their resources. Now, the problem is here, if police pull out of those communities where they don't look as so much of a force, then no police is ever present. If police is present in those communities, then we're over-policing. And part of this stems from, in my opinion, and my experience tells me, is that there is not a collective working relationship that is systemically consistent throughout the community. you may have one group over here saying one thing what they need from the police, and another group over here saying another thing, and the police never gets it right.
Brittany, when you hear Jill say that there's under-policing is a problem, do you agree?
You know, I really think the problem is that we're not talking about what safety looks like in our communities beyond policing. So, you know, when crime happens in Georgetown, they don't send a ton of police out there, right? When crime happens in the wealthy parts of New York City, they don't send a ton of police out there. They send them to Harlem. They don't send them over there. And so I want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how often policing is racialized, because I went to a private, highly affluent high school, and there were never any police at my school. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, we can see a police officer drag a young woman from her desk at a public school, right? And there were certain kinds of kids at that school that the community deemed needed to be policed. But if we are truly thoughtful about, again, systemically how we create safe communities from the bottom up instead of over-policing them from the top down, then we won't be having this conversation. Because
So how do you do that?
So education will be such that people don't have to engage in crime in order to make money and feed their family, right? People won't have to engage in certain activities because they've got employment opportunities, healthcare, housing, all of the things that it takes to create a whole healthy community. And if we're thinking about public servants as we should be, folks who derive their power from the people and who should all be serving and protecting us, not just the police officer, but the teacher, the firefighter, the city councilor, the mayor, if all of those people are getting together with parents, children around the table and saying, how are we building that community from the bottom up, and making sure that when we do need officers, right, that the policies are such that we can see justice in our communities and not harm done, that's the conversation I want to see.
Dub, what would you do differently in training to avoid situations like that cost the life of your son?
I think it's attitudinal. I think the attitude of law enforcement has changed so much over the last 3 or 4 decades. We're very adversarial. We use a lot of labels. The labeling is a process that probably started in the, certainly in the late 70s, early 80s. We label things, from the standpoint of constitutionality. Almost every constitutional amendment there is being violated in one way or another today. We have district attorneys who have the power to determine justified or unjustified. That's not due process. It's not guilt or innocence. But officers are not taken into the courtroom where the evidence is presented against an officer who has wrongfully taken some life. It's stopped before it gets to the court, the judge, the jury, with immunity. We have immunity for law enforcement personnel. If they qualify for immunity, then there is no prosecution. The evidence can't be used. So there's so many problems, and it's complicated.
Jill, you, like all of us, have heard of the Ferguson effect, which is the hypothesis that law enforcement, in response to the criticism of the police in Ferguson and other incidents like it, has taken a more hands-off approach to their jobs and are, in effect, neglecting their duties. Do you think the Ferguson effect is real?
You know, I don't know. It's so hard to know anything in criminal justice. There's so little really good information. I would suspect not, because again, when you say police department, you're talking about municipal bureaucracies, and they tend to have their own momentum. They tend to work in certain prescribed ways year after year. They're actually, every police chief I've ever known has talked about trying to turn the Titanic. It's very hard to change anything in these organizations. And so I would imagine they kind of go, the machinery kind of works the way.
Let me ask you the same question, Cedric.
Now, anecdotally speaking, I would say no, and certainly not in DeKalb County, Georgia, certainly not in Atlanta, certainly not in Rochester, New York. But for a brief moment, we saw that in Baltimore, and for a brief moment, you saw it here in New York City. So you can't blank, you can't cover all or paint all police departments with the same brush. But here's what's important I need to be able to convey, is that policing in this country needs major reform. And we got to reform our police departments.
And where would you start?
that begin with how we recruit, even how we advertise. We got to get away from advertising with SWAT gear and start advertising with this being a guardian profession and not an occupying force profession. So that in and of itself, how we start out is how we're going to end up. And I think if we start recruiting better, if we start training better, if we take the lessons that we're learning every day and take these young men and women who are coming out of college, coming out of military, coming out of high school, coming out of wherever, they have a far greater advantage than I had 39 years ago when I started in this profession. They're much more culturally aware and sensitive. They're very much in tune with technology. Their minds are open to change and differences and to new ideas. And I think those are great opportunities that we all have to make sure in our own communities that type of recruiting is taking place. Now, once you have them in your police environment, you also have to make sure that they're managed appropriately. They got to have good bosses. They got to have good role models, because they truly are your next generation of police officers that are going to provide that guardian relationship. But here, and I'll close with this, there is no public safety without police, and there's no public safety without community. You have to be partnered. You have to be married to each other in order to reduce crime. People could give less than a damn about what percentage of crime has been reduced in their community. What people are more concerned with in most cities across this country is, what is my relationship with my local police department? Do I have to feel feared of them because I see blue lights? People are more concerned about their relationship as opposed to reducing crime. And you're not going to reduce crime in this country. I don't care what technology you have. I don't care what data-driven information you're operating from. If you don't have that relationship between that police and that community, you will not see that reduction in crime that you're looking for.
Brittany, let me ask you about the Ferguson effect in Ferguson, since you are right there at ground zero. I mean, Ferguson has symbolic taken on a symbolic resonance, but it's also a place.
Yeah.
And what changes have you seen after all the attention from the Justice Department, from journalists, from the state of Missouri? What are things like there now? Are they better?
You know, there's been a lot of effort put in. And we've seen some changes. The city council is slightly more diverse. There's a new police chief in Ferguson. And yet, as much as things change, many things still stay the same. But I want to push a little bit on the premise of the question, because if we're going to blame something on Ferguson, we have to talk about what the roots of Ferguson were, right? The uprising in Ferguson and in Baltimore and the movement that we've seen spread across this country exists because institutional racism and oppression exists. And so if you want to talk about what happens because what is or is not happening because of Ferguson, you have to talk about why Ferguson happened. I'm not concerned about talking about the branch of the tree. I'm concerned about talking about what's at the root, right? And how we uproot the whole thing. And so what has continued to happen across St. Louis is, yes, a conversation about relationships, but I think we were talking about this earlier, I think we have to be thoughtful about what relationships get us. Relationships are important, but they only get us so far, right? This idea that an officer like Darren Wilson is just a bad apple is problematic, because we're really talking about entire systems that can be complicit in people's death. Now, when you talk about a system, that means that people actually have to face the fact that we're implicated too, right? That if you've been in this system for however many years, that you're implicated as well. But we have to talk beyond relationships, even though they're important, to systemic changes. And so some of the things we've been working on in Ferguson and quite broadly, quite frankly, nationally, are issues of citizen review and oversight of the police, are issues of demilitarization, use of force. We just put out a report, and you would be surprised how many major metropolitan police departments, not only is their use of force policy not available online, when they release it, it's heavily redacted, as the Houston Police Department did when we did a Freedom of Information request of them, and how many of those policies do not prioritize the preservation of life. I mean, that phrase is not even in there. So when you talk about using deadly force and assessing when it's necessary or not, the guidelines and the rules that you have going into that situation, some of them don't even talk about preserving life as the #1 priority.
Jill, I'm sorry, I didn't want to stop you, please.
But I was just going to say, so this idea that we get to relationship and also get to systemic change is critically important if we're going to see a change in the Fergusons all across America.
Jill, Cedric said people are concerned about their relationship with the police more than they're concerned about the amount of crime. Do you agree?
That is probably generally true. The truth about violent crime in this country is that it's very, very concentrated into pockets, and many people never experience violent crime, and some people experience it as a daily part of their lives. In South Central LA, in Watts, where I was working, in 8 square miles, they were having 80 murders a year during the first...
How many?
60 to 80 a year. So you can do the math. The people who were dying were primarily poor black men, not just, by the way, youth, not just 18 to 24, but all the way up into their 40s. And there were years where not a single one of those deaths made the paper or got any news coverage at all. To those people, to people who are losing sons, it's everything. But, you know, even in a high homicide context, that's a very small minority of people who are feeling it so directly. They're always going to be a minority. Most people are not going to feel that catastrophic loss from crime.
We are out of time. So I thank our panelists, and I thank you all for listening.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Travis. I'm the president of John Jay College, and it's wonderful to see all of you here on our campus. I have the honor of being asked to moderate this next panel at the American Justice Summit. The title of the panel is provocative. It's The Culture of Punishment, and asks the question embedded in the subtitle, it doesn't have to be this way. So over the day that we've been together, we've had a lot of conversations where the question of punishment, punitiveness, has come up in the panel discussions. Started with Tina's talking about the phenomenon of mass incarceration, why that has happened, why we have so many people in prison, which used not to be true in this country. We then talked about jails, we talked about the way we treat the mentally ill. We had a brief discussion about school discipline, another expression of punishment. We then had a discussion about immigration detention, excessive fines, the findings of the Justice Department in Ferguson. So the thread that runs through all of the discussions that we've had today is this very profound question: why is it this way? Why is it this way in our country? So just to frame it as a question is, why is America so punitive? Or why is America now so punitive? Have we always been so punitive? What is it about our country, our character, our culture, our history, our experience with issues of race, our experience with immigration? Why are we this way? So it's a big question. So the panel is not going to help us answer the question, they're going to help us think about the question so that we can leave here today just with some better insights. This is now a conversation that's underway in academia, a lot of writing on this question about punitiveness in America, trying to measure this, so scholars are looking at it in this way. But our hope is that this is a realization so that at this point in the summit, we're starting to tie some pieces together. So we are so fortunate to have the panel that's on the stage with me today to shed some light on this question, this phenomenon about punishment. Must it be this way? And we're going to go pretty deep. We're going to go deep inside of the prison experience with two individuals on the stage with me who have lived parts of their lives, years of their lives, in American prisons. In one case, we'll have a firsthand discussion of life in solitary, which we talked about briefly this morning. We also have two experts, corrections experts. I'll introduce everybody in a second, but one of them is a psychologist, the nation's preeminent psychologist, understanding the effects of incarceration, in particular the effects of solitary. And to help us step outside of the American experience, we have a European expert, one of the leaders in the corrections profession in Germany, who is here to help us think about a point of comparison, a point of reference, so that we can take on some tough questions about our own history and culture. So my hope is that we'll ask the first presenter to help us really paint the picture of an experience that some of us have had, some of us have not had, but it's so important for us to all to understand, and that's life inside a prison. So the first person I'll call on in a second after I've introduced all of them is Ronald Simpson Bay. Ronald is somebody known to many of us. He's actually a graduate of Just Leadership USA and now works for them, organizing an alumni network of formerly incarcerated individuals around the country. He spent 27 years in prison in the state of Michigan. He then took it upon himself to become familiar with the law, helped find a way to get his conviction overturned. Today he's a free man, an advocate for justice, spent time with the American Friends Service Committee, and now works at Just Leadership USA. Seated to my immediate left is Andrea James. Andrea is somebody who, in her professional life, is a lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, real estate lawyer, and then was convicted of a crime that sent her to federal prison for 2 years. She has come out of that experience as an advocate for the perspectives of women and mothers on the issues of mass incarceration and justice reform. She has created an organization called Families for Justice as Healing. I love the title, and she is now affiliating with a national association that's advocating for the perspectives of women. And in the middle here, sitting next to Andrea, we have Jörg Jesse, who serves as the Director General of the Prison and Probation in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, which is in northeastern Germany, if you know your map, former Eastern Germany. Jörg was our host when a number of us went on a visit to Germany, sponsored by Vera and John Jay, to look at prisons and provide a comparative perspective. You've seen some press about that, and 60 Minutes is about to do something on our trip there. Jörg is also very active in prison issues throughout Europe. We're very fortunate that he is here. And finally, I want to introduce a good friend and close colleague of mine, Craig Haney, who is a distinguished professor of psychology and presidential chair at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and as I said before, is, I think, the preeminent national expert on psychological effects of incarceration, and particularly solitary confinement, and was a member of the National Academy panel that I chaired. So, what a wonderful group we have. Please join me in just thanking them for coming, and then we'll get right into it. So, Ronald, we heard this morning a very poignant description of life in immigration detention, using the word icebox. You probably have your own language for the experience that you want to share with you, but just, you spent many years in prison, many years in solitary. Just, what's a day like? Just help us imagine your life to give some context to this discussion of punishment and punitiveness.
Thank you. Good question. Thank you for inviting me here. I'd like to first say that time in prison in and of itself is challenging beyond belief. But time in solitary is just like, it's mind-boggling. People lose their minds in solitary. Imagine having everything in your life regulated to the minute. What time you can get up, what time you can go to bed, what time you eat, how much water you can use when you go to the bathroom, how many days you can use the shower out of the week. Sunlight is even regulated in solitary. In Michigan, they'll close the shutters so you don't even get sunlight. Solitary confinement is one of the most dehumanizing attributes of prison. That's above and beyond all the other ones. Solitary confinement in and of itself is a unique form of torture that we should try to eliminate at all costs.
Thanks. So, Andrew, if you could also share your thoughts, perspectives, insights on your time in prison, and just help us understand your perspective as a woman and as a mother.
I went to prison after more than 22 some odd years of working within the criminal legal system, as all the way from a youth worker working on the streets to a trial lawyer, or a criminal defense lawyer, and a real estate lawyer. And I have to tell you, there wasn't much that anybody could tell me about how broken that system, this system is, how much restructuring, complete dismantling and restructuring that needs to be done, until I became an incarcerated woman and walked into the prison in the federal prison for women in Danbury, Connecticut, where I served a 24-month sentence. And my experience pales in comparison to the women that I was incarcerated with. Many of these women just did not need to be incarcerated. They did not need to be in prison. The majority of these women were poor. They were women of color. They were mothers. And they had been separated due to these very long, outrageously long draconian sentences due to very distance-related drug charges. Many of them were there for conspiracy. They weren't even there for charges that directly implicated them in selling drugs. And they received very long sentences that had them separated from their children. I was a lawyer. I left my children standing in the parking lot with my son and with my husband and my parents and my older children. The women that I was incarcerated with weren't anywhere near so lucky. The last time they laid eyes on their children may have been 6, 7, 8 years ago, and that was after a drug raid or something, where the last time they laid eyes on them, they were looking out of the back window of a law enforcement vehicle and watching some other entity take their children away. That is incredibly heartbreaking. I was in the federal system. Women are there who are thousands of miles away from their children. Their families do not have the means to bring their children to see them. So it was incredible to feel the heaviness within that women's prison from the heartbreak that the women were experiencing. On top of these extraordinarily long, unfair, unjust sentences, they also had the sentence of being separated from their children.
Andrew raises such an important point when we think about the punitiveness in our country and how we have put so many more people in prison and jail, that there are these ripple effects outside, beyond the individual who's incarcerated. And the first concentric circle there to be affected are children and loved ones, partners, spouses, parents. Ronald, just give me your sense to continue this thought about relationships with families and the outside world during your time in prison in Michigan, and what you experienced and how you talked about it with others who were incarcerated with you.
I'd like to kind of spin off the ripple effect you just talked about. Let me put in a little context. I went to prison in 1985 at 27 years old for a crime that I did not commit. And I subsequently got it reversed by my own work, and the courts finally reversed my conviction. I was released. However, during that time, on Father's Day 2001, I had been in prison about 16 years at this time. I had 4 children, a son and 3 daughters. And I'm waiting for a visit from my children. Dad, we come to visit you today, and I'm all excited. I'm happy. A visit from a child in prison is like manna from heaven. So I'm sitting, I'm waiting. No one shows up. About 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, I start calling around. What's going on? And I come to find out, my ex-mother-in-law said, you haven't heard Ronnie? I said, no, what happened? She said, your son, Ronnie, had been shot and killed by a 14-year-old juvenile. My son was 21 at the time. In the streets of Flint, a 14-year-old juvenile killed my son. So the ripple effect was off the charts. But in response to that, I had been in prison long enough and matured enough to know that, seeking revenge was not the answer. So I sought to forgive this child and to give him a second chance. I advocated for him to be treated as a juvenile in the juvenile system instead of an adult, because I knew he would get the assistance he needed and the second chance he deserved through the juvenile system.
So we want to come back to this theme that we've surfaced here. Your work with an organization that has healing in its name, your work now and after that awful incident on behalf of a different response to crime. But let's just stick for a moment with the issue of the effects of incarceration and particularly of solitary. So Professor Haney, just from your research and your scholarship over many years now, you've been looking at the damage caused by incarceration generally and particularly by isolation. So it's hard to talk about this with the objectivity of a scholar because it is so deeply human, what we're talking about, but just give us some top-of-line assessment of what your research has shown over the years.
Let me preface this by saying that when I talk about some of the effects of prison, I don't mean in any way to pathologize the people who experience these effects. I'm pathologizing the environments that they've been forced to adjust to. But they are environments that have effects. They have, in many instances, harmful effects. So Glenn Martin talked a little earlier today about meeting the best and the brightest in prison, and you're hearing from some of them on this panel.
Thank you.
But what is best about them and what is brilliant about them was not really fostered in prison. They are the people you see and you heard from and you'll hear from later, and they're in the audience in spite of, not because of, what happened to them in prison. Prison is a profoundly dehumanizing environment. Prisoners are treated as less than human. They are degraded by the procedures, by the physical architecture, by the rules and regulations to which they are subjected. Not even really treated as less than human, but sometimes treated as inanimate objects to be moved around and harmed without a thought being given to the reaction or the consequence on the person. Prisons are profoundly depriving environments. So the courts have ruled that people who are in prison have the right to the minimum necessities of life, by which they mean food, clothing, and shelter. But they most decidedly don't mean the kinds of things that sustain the human spirit or the human psyche. Very few, if any, prisons in the United States provide prisoners with those things. Prisons are dangerous places to live. There is an unpredictability and an uncontrollability to the danger that prisoners are vulnerable to. And they are punitive places, not only in the sense that all of that happens to you in prison as a result of the punishment that is inflicted on you when you go there, but if you don't handle all of those deprivations and that degradation and that danger in the way the prison wants you to handle it, its response to that is more of that, not less of it. So it is an internally punitive environment. It's why we have in this country in the neighborhood of 100,000 people who were confined in solitary confinement, largely because they were unable to come to terms with the awful dehumanization and degradation and deprivation to which they were subjected, many of them mentally ill and who are responding with their mental illness to the nature of these conditions, but punished nonetheless for their inability to tolerate this extraordinarily harsh environment.
So 100,000 people is a big number. And we've seen, certainly in the popular press, a lot of attention being given now to reform. I don't know if it's a movement or some, just at least active discussion on solitary confinement. So from your perspective, Professor Haney, taking into account the President's recent statement, our mayor here in New York City has limited solitary on Rikers Island for juveniles. Greg Marketel this morning talked about his reforms. National Association is talking about solitary. So is this real? And is it, how do we know whether it's moving? And is it going to make a dent in that 100,000?
It is real. It is going to make a dent in the 100,000, but it is nowhere near enough. And I would say the same thing about prison reform in general, that what we are doing here today, what other organizations and groups that you're hearing about are doing on the ground and in communities is incredibly important. Statements from the President are incredibly important, but we all need to keep in mind, it took us 40 years to get here. This will not change overnight. It is a problem of enormous magnitude. It runs deep into the culture that we live in, and it has to be addressed at that deep level in addition to the level at which it's being addressed now. The people who are making changes in their prison systems, like Greg Marketel, deserve our admiration, but they are a minority of correctional leaders, still a minority of correctional leaders in the country.
Just quick answers, both from Ronald and Andrea, before we hear from Jorg. What's your take on the sort of this national mood that solitary is being reduced and we're going to reduce the prison population? Does this make you feel hopeful, or are you cynical about this, either of you, or both of you? What do you think, Andrea?
Well, you have to stay hopeful, of course, and there's a lot of really good work, I think, that's going on, and I think the focus we should put on is what's happening from the grassroots, what's happening from out of the communities.
Right.
And that is that's not receiving enough of attention. A lot of the work so far has been done, or not done, but commandeered, I'm gonna say it, commandeered by nonprofits that aren't including the voices of those who are most impacted. And when we do that, we are not creating a well-informed, restructured system. And we have got to create the space for those people who are the experts. We are always brought to speak, and everybody else but those of us who are there, who have the experience, are described as the experts. We are the experts. We are the people who know what the changes are that need to happen.
Just quickly, Ronald.
I'm eternally hopeful and optimistic. I see the silver lining in everything. I think that, the measures are being taken recently with the president's, abolishing solitary. I think that's a good thing. It's symbolic. It only affects about, 30 prisoners in the federal system. But it's a step in the right direction. Not
quite 100,000 nationally, right?
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction because it gives notice to the states that they can follow suit and feel safe about doing it, because politicians and people that make these decisions are real skittish. But if they see the leaders taking these positions, then they'd be more likely to take them themselves.
So, Jorg, you know the American system to some extent. You've been listening to this conversation. We've had discussions over beer and Bratwurst in Germany. So, does the experience that's been described by Andrea and Ronald bear any relationship to the German experience for people who are, you have prisons, people in their prisons, in terms of length of time, use of solitary, the conditions of confinement, the relationship to family? Just reflect on what you're hearing.
I've heard so many sad stories in this morning. It was a bit depressing for me, I have to say. So much anger and fear and aggression, and I think, or I ask myself the question: how can anything good come out of it? And what's the idea behind it? What about humanity? And what about chances, second chances? And on the other hand, I see the ones you talked about, the director generals, the criminologists in the US who want to change something. And to answer the other question, I'm hopeful, yeah. The German system is completely different. It starts with a constitution with the first sentence, human dignity is inviolable. To protect it and defend it is the duty of all state authority. So what's state authority? It's our officers. It's definitely, because they have to handle people who are incarcerated. Next step is our prison law. And our prison law says by serving his sentence, the prisoner has to be enabled to lead a life in social responsibility without committing further crimes. And also, it's a protection of the society during the time he's in prison. Then we have 3 principles. The first principle is the normalization principle. So life in prison should be approximately as far as we can as life outside. The second is the principle to be that we have to do anything against prison effects, imprisonment effects. And the third principle is the reintegration principle, the reintegration or resocialization principle. That means we have to work from the first day, not with the aim to create a system inside. The system inside is the second. We have to work that he shouldn't commit any further crimes, no more victims. Safety of the society is not the time he's imprisoned. Safety of the society is if this man comes out and he's better than before.
So just to make this, just put some numbers around it. So what's an average prison sentence in Germany? How long would somebody be in prison for?
10, 12 square meters.
No, how long will they, how long time?
Time.
Right.
The average time. We have 50% of our prisoners are released within 1 year. Within 1 year. 2/3 of our prisoners are released within 2 years, and 90% of our prisoners are released within 4 to 5 years. So,
wow, a little different. And the incarceration rate in Germany is
it's 79 on 100,000.
1/10 of ours.
Yeah.
So prison plays a different role in society and in the justice system, and sentences are much shorter.
Yes.
So we have a slide that we're going to put up that is a picture of a cell in Germany. It should be coming up any minute now. So Jörg, just before the skeptics take over, is that a typical cell in Germany?
I think it's a modern prison. It's one of the newer ones, but the interior is comparable to other prisons too. There's a big window. Daylight is very important, but not all the prisoners like daylight. We have personal items in it. They usually have a small TV. That's quite normal, yeah. That's
I'm just
the normalization principle.
I told Ronald and Andrea that they couldn't see the slide before sitting here. So, any quick reactions?
I'm assuming nobody's sharing that.
No, nobody. No, that's one.
It's a single cell.
Single cell. Yeah. Right.
Wow.
What do you think, Ron?
Compared to our prison, it's like out of a home and garden magazine. I'm like,
well,
like wow.
That's the normalization principle. You know?
Right.
You see it there.
Yeah. So these principles are powerful in Germany and have a lot of operational meaning. But let's just come back to the solitary comparison. So you were in solitary for how long?
The longest at one time was 18 months.
Okay.
But I
total
spent 18 months, 1 year, 6 months. It's been
end to end was put it all together. It's right.
About 3.5 years.
Okay. Craig, you said you interviewed somebody yesterday.
On Tuesday, who had spent 37 years in solitary confinement.
Right. In the state of Pennsylvania.
Now, that's not a norm, but it happens.
Yeah. So just to give a sense of scale. So what are the rules in Germany governing you have solitary confinement, but what are the rules governing solitary?
Of course, we have solitary confinement. It's up to 3 months per year. And if there is someone so dangerous and problematic that he has to be in solitary confinement longer than 3 months, the prison needs the consent, the permission of the higher level. That means the Ministry of Justice in the state.
At any given time, how many people in solitary in Germany?
Roughly longer than 3 months, you mean? Or
No. Well, let's do
very few. Very few. When the Americans were in our prisons, they always said, oh, "Let's show us your solitary confinement units." And I think there were no one in it. And they had looked at the books, and they said, "Oh, the last one was here a fortnight ago for 3 days or 5 days, something like that." Wow. So I think solitary confinement is, we have a re-socialization principle, you know, and not a socialization principle.
So we're almost out of time, and I want to start with Craig just answering the question we want to leave hanging, because it's too big to answer in the time we have. Why do you think the American system is the way it is, and so different from what we know in Europe? What does it say about our character? What does it say about our levels of violence? And I don't want to leave people depressed, but how do we overcome this? Because we have two people on the stage who are doing work on restorative justice principles, as we would call it, and the healing and the work you did with your son's murder. So there are glimmers of hope here, but just take us to the sort of the American character question.
Well, I don't think it speaks to any unique stain in the American character. I do think, though, it speaks to a stain in American history, and that's racism. I think it's impossible to avoid the historical fact that the ramping up of mass incarceration began in the United States on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, and it was very effectively politically exploited and has continued to be exploited for 40 years. That's not the only dimension to the mass incarceration movement, but it was a critical fulcrum point that was used to mobilize anger and to mobilize approval for punishment.
Ronald, you're sort of lightning round here. So what does this say about America? And you're going to get to not talk about us, but you can talk about Germany.
I would just say that, I would reflect on one of Dr. Martin Luther King's quote. He said, "We must learn to live together as brothers or die apart as fools." So I think we need to put the humanity back into being, human.
Yeah, great.
And to me, that's the overarching message.
Okay. So, Jorg, we had a brief discussion downstairs about some of the German history that is relevant to where you stand now in terms of your approach to incarceration. So why is Germany where you are?
Well, we changed a lot, and maybe we learned out of our history, but our new constitution from 1949 is completely different to the years before, and human dignity is a very, very important part in it. And our officers, they have to swear an oath on our constitution. So I think it's very important to think outside, not inside prison systems. They all have to come back, and our duty is to work with them to give them second chance, opportunities. And on the other hand, the prisons are safe. We don't have escapes. We don't have attacks against, very, very few attacks against our prison officers, and quite few attacks among prisoners. It's calm, calm. And working.
Andrea, you get the final word here. So you've reflected on the American sort of experience with punishment, and what do you think we should think about ourselves?
Well, we need to start with just stop incarcerating people for poverty and for the illness of addiction. And we need to stop sending women, particularly mothers, to prison.
Right. On that final note, thank you to the panel. Thank you all for coming. And let's go do some work. Okay, thanks. Great.
system so accurate it can even predict when the crime will occur, what type of crime it'll be.
Computer program that can actually predict where crimes will happen.
New Yorkers are one step closer to living in the Matrix.
Hi, my name is Ken Oletta, and this man needs no introduction. Second-time police commissioner of the largest police force in the world. Bratton, thanks for joining.
Great to be here again.
You've declared in the past that predictive policing is the wave of the future. And obviously it intends to use data to try and detect and prevent crime. What's its success in New York?
Success is still unknown because it's just really beginning. I've been in the business 45 years, came into it in the 70s during what was called the professional era of policing. The idea of better training, better education of officers, better supervision would make for a better police force. Coming out of the civil rights era of the 60s, the Kerner Report, and the idea that police needed to be better trained. In the 80s, that despite all of that, with the issues of guns, violence, drugs, crime rates exploded, prison populations began to increase. And then in the 90s, we began to correct it. We embraced the philosophy of community policing, partnership, problem solving, focus on prevention, returning to Sir Robert Peel's emphasis on prevention. In the 21st century, we moved into the intelligence era where we have the capability to gather up huge amounts of information, analyze it, and put cops on the dots, emerging patterns and trends of crime. But in doing that, and certainly in this city, the issue was too many cops basically on those dots. And so that the stop, question, and frisk controversy, which is so universally known and understood here, 2010, almost 700,000 stops, largely of minority young males. As we move forward, we have now been over to reduce. Last year, I think we had about 25,000 stops, but crime continues to go down in the city to record lows. Where we are now in 2015 is by our use of technology, huge investments in technology, is we're moving into the predictive policing era, where we can really anticipate that a crime is likely to occur in this location during this period of time if there's not an intervention. It's like a doctor looking at a patient and analyzing that patient and saying, you have the beginning symptoms that if I give you a medicine, a prescription, I can stop that cold from getting worse. And I'm dealing with a cold, so excuse me if I sound stuffed up. And that's what we're trying to do with predictive policing by putting cops into an area to prevent it from happening. But more importantly than that is when they go into the area that they're known, neighborhood policing, and that they are sensitive to the issues of the community. That's what the partnership comes in.
What do you say? There are some critics who argue that it becomes another form of, potentially, of racial profiling, the way you thought stop and frisk did.
I don't see that. I'm aware of those arguments that are being made, but I don't see it that in policing, we respond to 911 calls. We respond in this city to 311 calls. So we don't create those calls. So the preponderance of police response that goes into poor neighborhoods, into minority neighborhoods, into, in this city, housing developments, which are a combination of minority and poor, that those two generators of police action are not controlled by the police. What we do control is, as in stop, question, and frisk, self-initiated activity. And so to deal with that self-initiated activity, what we're attempting to do is effectively get the police to see the community, police to see us, get the police to hear the community, get the community to hear us, so that we can find some common ground to deal with the issues that generate the 911 crime calls, the 311 quality of life calls. And so to that end, that, for example, in this city, every one of my offices by March will have one of these. It's a custom-designed smartphone. It has a significant number of apps that will help those officers to predict where a crime is going to occur. It'll help those officers also to interact with the public because we'll be able to give the public great amounts of information. If an officer stops somebody because he has a photo of a suspect, he's able to show that person I stopped you because, one, you look very much like, here's the photo, here's the description. But more importantly, it gives our officers timely information. An example just from yesterday, we had a series of bank robberies over the last couple of weeks in Manhattan, up to almost, I think, about 15. Yesterday, the character committing them was literally going bank to bank to bank and being turned away.
This is the guy with the Band-Aids on his face?
That's the guy with the Band-Aid. And my officers got on their smartphone. They had programmed the smartphone that it would vibrate, alert them as the bank robbery calls were coming in. So before a dispatcher in the 911 center could even broadcast the call, the detectives were getting the vibe that the bank robbery had just occurred. They were able to respond immediately to the area and got them. Just one use of this technology. Another app we have here, which will be of great benefit in the city of immigrants and the city of so many languages, is the language app. You can speak into this phone on that app, and it will translate orally and in writing for my police officer to be able to, if an English-speaking officer is dealing with a Spanish-speaking victim, the ability to communicate so much more in a city with 60 million tourists. So as you're aware, Ken, we've embarked on a very significant undertaking in the de Blasio administration to find common ground with our communities where we lost so much ground over the last number of years. And the basics we're trying to build upon is how do we develop more trust? Technology is one of the ways, training, certainly another, better tactics in dealing with crime, and then also dealing with the issue of terrorism, which is of so much concern to our Muslim community, feeling that they may feel the impact that the Black or Latino community felt for so many years by police unnecessarily intruding themselves into their lives. So there's a lot underway at this time.
You mentioned training. One of the things you did last year with the mayor's support was to impose a requirement on everyone, including the commissioner, to take 3 days of retraining. And your aim was to change what you thought was the culture of the New York City Police Department, to create more empathy on the part of. How do you measure whether you've succeeded or failed at that?
Let me just briefly explain what we're doing with training. That we have totally revamped the 6 months of training that our recruit officers get. Totally revamped it. Including in the middle of that training, after 3 months, they are assigned out to a precinct for 10 days to learn about the precinct, midpoint in their training, to go out and feel it. Because many of our officers don't come from the neighborhoods they're going to police. When they graduate, they go back to that same precinct, but now they are assigned to a volunteer field training officer, a senior officer who's been specially trained to mentor them for their first 6 months. The old system was the kids would roll out of the academy, be put into the highest crime neighborhoods under the supervision of a sergeant, with 12 of them, and be encouraged to get activity. And we saw the results of that with the disaster of stop, question, and frisk. What we are also doing with that training is that we are expanding the in-service training. After academy, every year, my officers will go through a minimum of 5 days of training, where in the past they only went through 2 days of firearms training. They will now have expanded training to deal with issues, stop, question, frisk, the wide range of issues that are necessary to teach them to deal better with the public. In addition, many other officers will get additional training. Almost 5,000 of my officers this year, for example, will be getting 4 days of training on how to deal with the emotionally disturbed. Why so much emphasis on training? Because we understand you would not want to go to a doctor who received his education 30 years ago and never kept updated on the latest trends in medicine. Similarly, you don't want police who received training 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of which we now find was not appropriate and certainly not appropriate for today. So the training is essential. And one example I will give you of the benefit of training. In the 1970s, the New York City Police Department was averaging, in many of those years, over 900 incidents in which police used their firearms, at a time when 12 police officers a year were being killed, in which hundreds of people were being shot in the city. Last year, 2015, we had, I think the figure was 65 incidents in a 36,000-person police force where officers fired their guns. 65 times. 18 of those were for attacking dogs. A number of them were accidental. In 32 instances, we actually were in a combat situation. Think of this, in a city of 8.5 million people, with 36,000 cops on only 32 instances. During the course of that, 8 lives were taken by New York City police officers, all of them taken during an attack upon those officers. So we have learned the training can significantly reduce from 900 in the 70s down to 65. We have the lowest use of force, particularly deadly force, use of firearms, and use of force of any large-scale police department in America at this current time. So with training, we're hoping to address a lot of the issues that the community has raised with us: unnecessary force, indifference, so many of the things that have been identified.
One of the things that the City Council has raised with you is this. One of the things the City Council has raised with you and the mayor is that they want to decriminalize some of the quality of life arrests that people undergo, and I wonder how. I mean, if you take away public urination as one, drinking out of a container, alcoholic beverage is two. There are a number of others. What does this do to your lifelong commitment to something called broken windows?
Broken windows, quality of life. Thank you for that question. Because it's a live issue at the moment. We've been engaged for the last year and a half in discussions with the City Council. We're very confident that in the next several weeks, next month or so, we'll come to a resolution of the issues. That the Council and a significant number of their members really feel that a lot of these quality of life types of violations, fare evasion, public urination, drinking in public, have been used inappropriately by the police, particularly against the communities of color. At the same time, when I look at where my 311 calls are coming from, my 911 calls, what are the 311 calls about? Urination, particularly in the public housing developments, that people calling about people urinating in the hallways. Noise complaints, barbecues on the streets with hundreds of people that disrupt the neighborhoods late into the night. So how do I find this balance where large parts of the community want something done, but there's a concern that the penalties are too draconian? Very much about the incarceration issue, which has been so much of the discussion today, that the penalties for so many crimes are too severe, particularly for possession of drugs or conspiracy, non-violent crimes. What I think will come to an agreement around is that I will not lose, my police officers will not lose the ability to use criminal law, but the criminal law will not be the first resort. The first resort we would do is the scale: admonition, summons, arrest, if appropriate. But the first interaction would be a civil violation, so that if I stopped you for urinating, or I responded to a call of somebody urinating in one of the public housing development hallways, I would come in, I would check your ID, you have no record, you have no wants and wanted, I know who you are, I can give you a warning. I can eject you, or I can, and hopefully we'll be able to develop a warning form, which I would strongly support, that would be a written warning, so we could document repeated misbehavior, failure to correct behavior. And it would have, as we're also changing the summonses, so that the summons form will show issues of sex, issues of race, so we have an ability to determine, are we disproportionately impacting on communities of color or by sex. So the discussions with the council have been ongoing, and we expect that we'll come to resolution. Something I'd point out, and I'll close with this in terms of the question. Over the last 2 years, since the election of Mayor de Blasio, working with me and the police department, we have reduced by almost 1 million each year the enforcement actions of the NYPD. I have a larger police force than we had 2 years ago, but the enforcement actions by that police force are down. Stop, question, frisk by almost 600,000, summonses by hundreds of thousands, arrests, particularly for marijuana, minor drug-related offenses, down dramatically. Almost 1 million fewer police interactions with the communities in New York City.
In the wake of deaths at the hands of police officers in Ferguson or Baltimore or Staten Island, a wave has swept across the country to better monitor the police and check some of their potentially abusive powers. What is your reaction to that? I mean, you have more monitors in New York.
I don't have a problem with that. I was chief of police in Los Angeles for 7 years with the most extensive federal monitoring system in the history of the country. At the end of those 7 years, studies that were done by Harvard University. We commissioned Harvard to come in to do the studies for us. What had been the impact of the federal monitorship? Crime was down dramatically in the city, but maybe most importantly, relationships between the police and the community, and the relationship between the black community and LAPD had not been a good one. It was like literally open warfare for almost 50 years. And I felt very good at the end of 7 years that even the LA Times, which was a significant entity always going after LAPD, reported in an editorial that finally the corner had been turned on race relations, in that they were starting to get polling indicating that the majority of citizens, even in the black communities, felt that the police had become more responsive. As a result of the stop, question, and frisk controversy, we now have a federal monitor that's working with us on the development of our training procedures, our policies, and guidelines. We have an inspector general now that, like other inspector generals for other city agencies, has the ability to self-initiate investigations, make policy recommendations. The CCRB has been significantly strengthened under its new director, Richard Emery. Each of those entities, and in addition, I'm going to, relative to our terrorism activity, Handshoe agreement that will be adding a new individual to that, who we hope will be a very prominent jurist that we're conducting interviews now. So sum and substance, the department has, in the last 2 years, basically engaged in more oversight than at any time in its history, and at this point, probably has more oversight over it than any other police force in America, because we also have, above the Inspector General, is the Department of Investigation. We also have 2 U.S. attorneys who are not shy about investigating police, and 5 district attorneys. We work with all of them collaboratively. I'm not fighting the monitor. We're working very closely with CCRB. And what's the good news coming out of all this? 1 million fewer police interactions. CCRB complaints, even at a time when CCRB is attempting to encourage people to report.
Define CCRBs.
Civilian Complaint Review Board. And it is finding that complaints against police are down fairly dramatically by double digit, so that we are seeing a lot of changes that over time, like what had occurred in Los Angeles, will be beneficial. In the meantime, as I referenced, that while some deaths involving police action are very controversial, the case of Mr. Garner in Staten Island, for example, here in New York, that the amount of force used by the NYPD in the making of the almost 250,000 arrests we make is some of the lowest levels of force. And in that regard, we've just taken all of our use of force policies, reviewed them, put them into one place, and we'll be retraining our officers on these now contemporized, modernized new policies.
Let me try and squeeze in two last questions. Some people think of you and Mayor de Blasio as the odd couple. He's a left liberal by his own definition. You're not. And yet you have said you've never had better support in being commissioner in Boston or LA or here before than you have from him. What drug did you administer to him?
On this issue, the mayor really gets a bad rap. That, let's face it, the New York Post hates him, and if they can find anything wrong, they beat up on him. No, I think of myself in my profession as a progressive, that not too far to the right, not too far to the left, centrist, open to change, and certainly I think of myself as a transformational change agent in every police department I've worked in. There are certain principles I believe strongly in. Sir Robert Peel's first principle of the 9, which are every bit as relevant today as they were back in 1829 when he wrote them. The basic mission for which the police exists is to prevent crime and disorder. In the 70s and 80s, we focused almost entirely on serious crime and paid no attention to the quality of life crime that destroyed the city. The graffiti that covers every inch of space in the city, the prostitution, the 8,000 open-air drug locations that significantly exacerbated the drug problem, the violence that went with us, that it's, and all of you who are parents in the room understand that if you don't correct a child's behavior as they're developing, that behavior is going to get out of control when they get into their teenage years. So what we have to do in policing is find the right balance. By reducing by 1 million the negative police interactions, that's beginning to find balance. By giving officers more discretion to issue a warning, a civil warning, rather than a criminal summons or arrest, That's another effort to find balance. Where the mayor is, and where we are joined at the hip, is trying to find, he's a progressive, maybe much farther to the left on many social issues than I might be, but on law enforcement, we are very much centrist. He understands the importance of finding balance. Like a doctor treating a patient. You give the patient too much chemo, cancer, you're going to kill him. Similarly, if you give the patient, the community, too much enforcement, you're going to kill them, literally. And we saw some of that, unfortunately, in the city with stop, question, and frisk issues. So he is a strong supporter of quality of life, broken windows, but balanced with the idea that it needs to be done fairly, impartially, and done in a transparent way. And that's the effort we're joined in.
I want to thank Commissioner. We're out of time. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
As of today, 27 CPS students have been killed. As of today, 229 CPS students have been shot. That's not even counting alternative schools, dropouts. That's only Chicago public school students, because nobody's counting the other numbers. Every mother or father out here who's lost a child, you raise your hand. Every person out here who's a family member or a friend who has been shot or killed, lift your hand. It's called insanity.
The surest way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Antonio Goss, Joel Baitner, Michael Pierce, Christopher Travis, William Luttrell, Darnell Choice, Jawan Brooks, Andrew Powell, Michael Frazier Jr.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Hockenberry. It's a thrill to be here with you. It's a thrill to follow the police commissioner, Commissioner Bratton, and Canaletta. Those two guys look way too good, okay? And then Eric Holder's coming out after us, and he looks fantastic. I think I saw the three of them coming out of the Olympic-sized pool downstairs, so I don't know if that has something to do with it. We just saw some very disturbing images, and we've been talking about some amazing things all day today. Take the hand of the person next to you and think about this for a moment. This is not about policy. We are not here to think about policy. We are here because this is a sacred space. This is a sacred space because people are grieving. People are grieving for loved ones, and you're going to hear about them in this panel. People are grieving for principles. People are grieving for lost communities. People are grieving for a lost sense of the rule of law. And it's that we're all trying to get back. This is a sacred space. And with that sense of empowerment, let's proceed. Ada Pantoja, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Great, great. You intersected with a gun in your life, and it changed you forever in many different ways. When did a gun come into your life, and what were the circumstances?
It was a couple of years ago. So my story, I love to call it ride or die.
You call it what?
I call it ride or die.
Ride or die.
So I was with my boyfriend at the time, and he took care of me and he took care of my kids. So because he did that, I was there by his side all the time. So we dropped off my kids after my daughter's basketball game, dropped them off, went with him to go down the street, go see his peoples, his customers, picked up two people, didn't know they were being followed. So detectives followed us, and he didn't put on his turn-in signal, so they stopped us, took us out the car, searched us.
And when you say customers, he was involved in the drug trade?
Yes, he was.
Right, and you knew that?
Yes, I did.
You were aware of that?
Yes.
Okay, proceed.
So they searched us. They found drugs on me. They arrested him for driving with a suspended license and on probation. Searched the car for 45 minutes. As soon as they put him inside the car to take him into custody, they pulled back the passenger seat of the car where I was sitting, where I wasn't supposed to be sitting. I was always the driver because I was a female. So because I was a female, you know, they wouldn't suspect nothing. They pulled back the passenger seat, and there went a 9mm that I did not know about.
And how did that change the way a simple, what do I know about simple, drug arrest became something very, very different?
They arrested me on the scene because of the gun, no questions asked. I was on a $68,000 bail that night, so I couldn't go home to my kids. Went to court, got held in custody for 5 months and 10 days waiting for fingerprints to come back, saying that I never was involved with the gun.
And the story, and it's a true story, is that it was his gun, not your gun.
Yes.
And your contact with the gun had only to do with the fact that you were sitting in that seat.
Yes.
It was not something you'd ever shot or used.
No, but because I was that girlfriend that was the ride or die, I never said nothing. So he told me that he was my ride or die and I was his. So
it was your obligation to take the fall here.
Not my obligation. He said he would just ride out with him and everything would be okay. Until we almost got into trial, and he threw me under the bus and told his lawyer that everything in the car was mine.
So you were the drug trafficker.
I was a drug trafficker.
You were the owner of the 9mm.
Yes, and I was looking at 20 years in jail.
And at that point, try to convey to the audience here how powerless you felt.
I felt like if I was the bottom of the barrel. I already felt bad because I was not next to my kids for 5 months and 10 days of their life. My kids got separated, and I would talk to them every 2 weeks. And my baby, still to this day, is always worried when I leave. I got out of jail, ended up with no apartment. I'm in a shelter now. I've been in a shelter for 3 years and 3 months. Going back to school, because while I was incarcerated, held on bail, I decided to sit down and think about things.
All right, before we get to that, because this is the best part of the story, how you thought about things in a way that I can't imagine thinking about things. But take us into that moment where you'd made some bad decisions, sure, but suddenly the system, because of the presence of the gun, didn't care about your regret over bad decisions, your willingness to seek justice and participate in the justice system. The presence of the gun there meant done, door slammed,
Yes.
life over.
Yes.
How did that feel, knowing that you were maybe, possibly a part of this, but the gun made it impossible to even make your own case?
At the time, okay. At the time, okay, because he told me everything would be okay. And then I finally realized that it was not going to be okay.
How many women are in your situation, do you think?
Plenty. More than the audience's hands full right now.
And these are women who are stuck in a situation where they're essentially partners in a criminal activity, and if a gun is present, and if their partner suddenly decides to throw them under the bus, it's over.
Yes, it is over.
When did you become an activist, and how did it occur to you to go from powerlessness to the activism that you're involved with today?
Okay, so I have a wonderful 13-year-old, who her name is Diamante. And after I came home, we live in Boston, so it's the MBTA. So we would be on the MBTA, and she would see the signs on the trains. And there's I can't even say the name right, post board?
Yeah.
And it says, his crime, your time. And my daughter would always stand up in front of everybody and say, look, mommy, there you go. And I always do that face. What are you doing to me right now? And so she would always do that.
Oh, 13-year-olds, you know?
Yes.
I've got 2 of them.
So you know my feeling.
Yeah.
And I had I was working at the time with a former job, and I knew my now boss, Jackie Furtado, and I knew her for a year and a half, and I finally came out and had the guts to tell her my problem, tell her my situation.
And basically, in the MBTA, your 13-year-old pointed out to you that there's a way for you to advocate, along with other women, for this, you don't do the time if it's his crime.
Yes.
And that became, what I have to say, is the best acronym I've ever heard in my life. Your organization is called?
Operation Lipstick.
And Lipstick stands for?
Lipstick stands for Ladies Involved into Putting a Stop to Inner City Killing, which Jackie Furtado named.
And in that role as a lipstick activist, what do you do, and how do you change things, and what's your message?
My message is to tell all the ladies out there to please not listen to your boyfriend, whatever it is, boyfriend, man, I don't care what he is. Just don't listen, because you don't want to lose your house, you don't want to lose your kids, and you don't want to start all over again, like me. I am still trying to get housing, I'm still trying to do everything as I can, and I'm fighting for all my stuff back.
Are we a violent nation, Ada? Are we a nation that sort of made a wrong turn somewhere? What do you see in all the headlines and the policy people and the politicians speaking about gun violence and the president talking? I mean, you're there in the foxhole, on the front line.
We're trying to get it back. We're working very hard to get it back.
So from grieving for lost lives, lost communities, a lost sense of justice, you have hope.
Yes, I have hope.
Ada Pantoja, thank you very much.
All over America, there are more than 100 million good guys and good gals too. Good Americans with guns. And a bunch of us are here right now.
Hello.
The National Rifle Association, all we believe in and fight for, has become a metaphor for the core American freedoms that we all want preserved.
I'm very aware that an awful lot of our evangelicals are members of the NRA and supporters of the NRA, and they are a very large factor in this.
There is no greater freedom, believe me, than the right to survive, to protect our families with all the rifles, shotguns, and handguns that we want.
And I'm learning about the NRA. I'm looking at it and trying to come to some conclusions about the place of the NRA and its role in this national conversation and its role in the church.
That was a clip from Armor of Light, a documentary that features Reverend Robert Shank, who's with us on the panel today. We'll hear more about his position on gun control and dealing with drug violence. Let me just say, or gun violence, in just a moment. Let me just say one thing. Ada's story was so visceral and real and authentic, don't you think? Do not think for a moment that this is the policy wonk panel that follows the authentic, real story. That's not how Tina rolls, okay? There is just as much direct connection to the kinds of stories that you just heard from Ada in each one of these people. I'm going to tell you just a little about each one, and over the course of the conversation, you're going to learn a lot more, and why these people who, but for guns, would probably be total strangers, or they would be friends in a completely other context, but because of guns and the way we think about guns in the United States, that intersection has brought them here today with some very important issues that we're going to discuss. Sandy Phillips, you would have no particular relationship to a gun, but for the fact that your daughter decided to go to the movies in Aurora, Colorado in 2012.
Well, we are gun owners. I used to hunt with my parents, used to shoot, trap, and skeet. And that was my only relationship with gun, and certainly not in any way associated with gun violence. So yes, if my daughter hadn't gone to the movie, I wonder what I would be doing today.
And we'll find out more about that in just a moment. Reverend Robert Shank, you're an evangelical pastor. What are your passions?
My passions first are for my wife, my family, my community, but especially in terms of the church community. It's what I've done with the entirety of my adult life. I became an evangelical Christian at age 17, and I've been on that track, trained as an evangelical minister, ordained, and now chair one of the oldest associations of evangelical clergy in the country. So it's really the organizing factor of my life.
And you're a gun violence activist.
Most certainly am, and it's defining pretty much everything that I do at this moment. And there's some risk in my community, and I think we'll probably explore the reasons behind that, but it's certain some things are worth taking big risks for.
David Kennedy is a criminologist here at John Jay. Welcome, David. How are you not an academic?
Not smart enough? I think the answer you're looking for is try to be street savvy. And so the question is, what ties us together? I think what ties us together is an absolute, visceral, passionate commitment that people, whether as individuals or as communities, should not get up every day afraid that they and their families and their loved ones are going to be shot and killed. And 30 years ago, pretty much by accident, I started a decade that pretty much brought me to the worst drug markets at the height of the crack era all across the country. And I spent those 10 years walking drug markets. And in settings like this, I always have to say, I was there in a professional capacity, unlike all the other white folks I saw out there. And I saw neighborhoods that were just saturated in fear and violence. And in a lot of these places, you could be in well-off white neighborhoods and practically hold your breath and walk to these places where the level of violence and victimization and fear and young men in wheelchairs because they were not dead but had survived, it was just the way people lived. And that's wrong, it's un-American, it's unacceptable, and I'm part of a big national community trying to do something about that.
Kenneth Thompson, District Attorney for my neighborhood, Brooklyn, New York. How do you deal with that fear in the people that you serve?
Well, the way I deal with it is to increase my determination to do something about the gun violence that has so many people in Brooklyn and all over the country in jeopardy. You know, we have 11,000 Americans murdered with guns every year. And what gets most of the attention are these mass shootings, which are horrific in nature. But what fuels America's gun violence or the homicide rate is the slaughter of black men day after day on the streets of our cities. And we need to be honest about it. And we need to call on Congress to stand up and do what is right. Because these guns have us all in jeopardy. So I acknowledge the fear, but I'm more determined to do something about these guns that are coming into New York City, into places like Chicago and Baltimore, from states down south. Guns that are flooding our cities, guns that are being brought in by these merchants of death. We have to do something about it.
So Sandy, I can imagine a time when you would be listening to District Attorney Ken Thompson, and that would be something far away. That would be an issue that, you know, something very important on the news, and you would care about it, but it didn't necessarily intersect with your life.
Yes, I often feel great guilt that after Columbine, I didn't do something. I said somebody has to do something. Didn't realize I was the person that needed to do something.
And that was just down the road from you in suburban
Exactly,
Denver.
exactly. But like he says, now that I know what I know and have experienced the loss that I've experienced, when you lose 72 people in a weekend in Chicago, That's not acceptable as America. It doesn't matter if they're gang related, it doesn't matter if they're innocent standing on a corner or sitting on their front porch. They're getting slaughtered, and that's not okay.
One minute your daughter's alive, the next minute she's gone.
Yeah.
What's that transition like?
There are no words for it. You just hear that news. We heard it through a phone call from the young man that was with her in the theater, and he called, and I remember looking at my phone and wondering why I was getting a phone call, because I knew they were at the movies. And I picked up the phone and I could hear the screaming going on in the background. And I said, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And he said, "There's been a shooting, and I think I've been shot twice." And as he's telling me this, I'm realizing that Jesse isn't on the phone. And I said, "Where's Jesse?" And he said, "I tried." And I said, "Is she okay? Tell me she's okay." And he said, "I tried." And I said, "Just tell me she's not dead." And at that point, from what my husband tells me, I started screaming. And from that instant, our world spiraled out of control. And we knew literally almost instantly that we were going to be involved in this issue, because I couldn't understand how this could happen again and again and again in America, and that there hadn't been any stopgaps made. So it took a lot of research, took a lot of gathering knowledge, and here we are 4 years later, and hearing that our Democratic candidates are talking about gun violence prevention. So we're pretty proud of that.
Now, Reverend Schenk, as an evangelical minister, how do you respond to someone with the kind of tragedy that Sandy experienced?
First of all, I think our community should be the one that reaches out with the greatest amount of compassion, concern, and intervention. It's just a fact that the evangelical church has been, I believe, very much on the wrong side of this equation. We are the least likely religious group to support any kind of restrictions on gun access, gun use. We are the religious group, certainly one of the top, with access, immediate access to guns, ownership of guns. I don't think we understand.
Can we explore that for just a second? What is it? Is it a conservatism? Is it a kind of libertarianism? Is it a terrible swift sword idea that better keep that rifle or pistol around the house because I never, you never know when the, I don't know, when the Philistines are going to show up or something?
Well, the truth is often said in jest, and I will say all of those things factor in. I do think that there's a very serious one, and I call it a moral, ethical, and even theological crisis in our community, and it's focused on fear. Fear of the future, fear of persecution, fear of the government, fear of those who might target us as a religious minority, even though we arguably are 30% of the population. All those things I think factor in, but most of all, I'm addressing, and we do this in the film. It was Abigail Disney who first challenged me to come out. I'm an outlier. I'm taking a lot of risk going up against this orthodoxy in my community. But I think it's in direct contradiction to our Christian principles. I think it certainly contradicts the teaching and model of Jesus Christ. And my greatest passion, if you will, the focus of my work at the moment in this regard is to separate our evangelical community from what I think has been a very spiritually, morally, and ethically corrupting influence of the NRA and Gun Owners of America and the other gun culture. I think it nullifies what is the essence of our message. So, big job.
Let me talk a little bit about what I think is, and You know, it's easy to blame the NRA, but you recall the incident where a shooter went to Colorado Springs at a health clinic that was involved with abortions. And that is an issue that you have strong feelings about, right?
Very much so.
Mike Huckabee, a presidential candidate who describes himself as an evangelical, who was pressed on the issue of what happened in Colorado Springs, was asked after that event in which people lost their lives, innocent people lost their lives, do evangelicals condemn the killing in this shooting? And he said something very interesting, which I think constitutes the sort of moral conundrum of the evangelical community as it's often expressed. We, of course, condemn killing. We condemn killing of any kind, just like we condemn the killing inside that clinic when it involves the killing of innocents who are aborted fetuses, who are people that God, loves just like anyone else. Does that moral equivalence have any place in the evangelical church?
I don't think that was a helpful answer. I think that was a political answer.
Yeah,
and that is part of the problem here, because when you look at historic Christian moral and ethical reflection, there is a rich body there, and there is an argument to be made, and I entered this whole conversation on the basis that I am a pro-life advocate. That means I respect the sanctity of every human life, not some. And we have to bring into the discussion in my community, we must bring race into the conversation. It's a very uncomfortable, very difficult one, but we have a history of it. There's a part of the history of American evangelicalism is the separation between the white and black churches, right at the inception of our movement, which created modern American evangelicalism. And in the white community, white churches, we're very uncomfortable discussing that topic. It's unresolved, and it's part of this discussion. So all of that has to be brought to bear, and that kind of truncated political response is supremely unhelpful at this time.
How many people saw the images of the folks in Oregon who, but for their automatic weapons, and maybe they still did to some of you, but a fairly forlorn situation that doesn't immediately inspire freedom. These guys in Oregon out in the middle of the cold snow claiming that they're part of a movement of pushing back the federal government. Professor Kennedy, why does a gun give them that sense that they're freedom fighters when under any other circumstances they would just be folks with pickup trucks stalled in a snowbank in Burns, Oregon?
You're not going to ask any hard ones, are you?
No hard ones.
I grew up shooting too, right? So I get how attractive a lot of this is. But on that one, I'll just say that apparently one of the issues here is that if you're too obsessed with weaponry, you forget to bring food, right? So this is really not a good prescription for an insurgent movement, right? When you have to be using the subsidized arms of the state to have people ship supplies from Amazon to you, this is not what Mao was all about, right? So we can let that one go. What I really want to do here, I want to draw some connections between this subject and some really important themes that the rest of the day has been focusing on. And if you are thick enough in this, these are very, very evident connections. But since most people don't live this every day, let me draw attention to a couple of things. So Ada's story is horrific, and it's also remarkably, remarkably common. So this is a story of a woman who ended up being saddled with her alleged loved one's firearm. As far as we know, this was not a gun that was used to hurt or kill anybody, but I work mostly with, let's call it inner city violence. These are places where people are dropping like flies And very little of the gun acquisition there is legal. It's trafficked, it's stolen, it's straw purchased, it's all that sort of thing. And I first encountered lipstick a year or so ago and was completely blown away by it because it is an example of not just community action, but in this instance, community action led by community, female community figures in these settings, organizing themselves to say to their networks, don't do this. And not just because you'll get caught, but because you're going to help somebody else get hurt. And none of us want that. Mothers particularly have moral standing here. So wonkishly, this is what academics call informal social control. See, I can do it when I want to.
But let's just distinguish that from the traditional wonkishness. You're talking about very hyper-human targeting of where violence occurs, not blanket sort of carpet bombing that we're used to seeing among wonk discussions that say, let's turn Baltimore into a fortress, for instance.
So I don't actually think that comes from the wonks, but in any case. So let me take exactly those two steps. So I spent a lot of time with law enforcement, and if you say to law enforcement, mothers in the community have much more power to actually affect these violence dynamics than you with the gun and the badge do. They do not believe you, right? So let me do an exercise with you I do with them. Raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of the police. Yeah, thanks. Down. Raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of your mother. Right? That's how communities really work. And
brilliant.
That's great.
Wonks can have fun too.
Yeah, I agree.
So the moral power focused in the right way on this issue is tremendous, right? So thank you for that. Now
let's return to that in just a moment because that moral power is really the engine we want to mobilize here. Ada talked about, since you raised Ada's story, about being powerless. Certainly, the loss of your daughter is a experience of utter powerlessness. But you had a subsequent experience of powerlessness in attempting to advocate for your loss. Can you describe that a little bit? And then I want to ask you, Ken, as to why the law seems to support Sandy's powerlessness here.
After Jesse was killed and my husband and I decided that we would go out into the world, so to speak, and advocate for gun violence prevention, we filed a lawsuit against the organizations that sold the online ammunition to the killer. And because of a law called PLACA,
well, before you mention PLACA, these are precisely the organizations, Ken, that you're watching all the time, the people who allow, you were just saying, that get these killer machines and weapons into the hands of people in communities all over America, right? Did you want to say a couple of things about that before we hear the kicker of Sandy's story?
Well, essentially, folks have to realize that these young men who are carrying these guns don't make these guns. These guns are flooding our cities from places down south that have weak gun laws, like Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina. And so until we do something about it, in Brooklyn, we had over 500 people shot last year. In Chicago, nearly 3,000 people were shot. In 2015 alone, the first 10 days of 2016, 120 people were shot in Chicago.
And that's the direct result of manufacturers marketing into these communities with the weak gun laws.
It's not just the manufacturers. These guns are being purchased online at gun shows through classified ads down south. We have got to wake up and say, wait, all of this is planned out in New York City, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and we have to do something about it, and we have to call on our elected officials to have some backbone and save American lives.
Or you file a lawsuit. You've got a loss. You've got a daughter who's dead.
Yes.
You've got a public health issue.
Yes.
You file a lawsuit. What happens?
We filed the lawsuit against the online dealers that sold over 4,000 rounds of steel-jacketed, green-tipped 223s that ripped through the seats, that ripped through the walls. And he did it online with literally a click of the mouse. and not even having to produce a driver's license. No background checks, no ID. And we knew that's wrong. That's just wrong. So we filed suit not for money, but to have them change their business practices. And the suit was thrown out on its first motion, and we were ordered to pay $264,000.
Which you still owe right now.
Well, right now he reduced it. The judge was so kind that he reduced it to $203,000, which of course, no matter what, even if I had to go to prison, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to give them a dime.
Why, Ken, does the law say that if gun manufacturers and gun salespeople are insulated from these kinds of questionings of their practices, that constitutes a kind of freedom in America to keep the government off our backs?
Well, it wasn't always like that. What happened is the former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, bankrolled a number of lawsuits against these gun manufacturers around the country. And so the gun lobby came together and they got their friends in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to pass this law in 2005 that gives them immunity with respect, with few exceptions. Like we just had a case in Wisconsin where a jury came back with a $5 million verdict. The point I'm making is that we should start a movement to stop this nonsense, to stop this bloodshed, and to vote these folks out. If they're not about saving our lives, we shouldn't have to bring lawsuits. This is just common sense. There's a young man right now in Brooklyn State Supreme waiting for his verdict. He was 14 years old. He pulled out a gun on a bus in Bed-Stuy and shot at another rival gang member. He's 14 years old. He pulled out a .357 Magnum and shot an innocent man in his head and killed him. And he's waiting to see if he's going to be convicted. We do these cases day after day, and enough is enough. We have to come together as a country, or we're going to continue to have these shootings, these mass shootings, and have these events.
From all four of you now, before we go, what hurts the most, and what do you most want to see happen in the next 5 years to make the passions that you've so articulated here come to some sort of social change? Sandy?
Well, for me, I really wanted to have it become a national issue, and the Democratic candidates have made it such. So for me, a lot of my dream has been fulfilled. Now we have to elect that Democratic candidate, and we have to vote out the GOP senators and congressmen that are still in their seats.
Reverend?
I want to see hearts changed, which will change minds, which will change behavior, which will change public policy. And I think the church is the place to do that.
David?
I'm actually feeling pretty optimistic. The world's going to hell in a handbasket out there, but I feel pretty good. And that's because for all the time I've been doing this, there's been a relatively small world of people who know, and as you say, once you see it, you can't turn away from it. There are communities all over this wonderful country where people have been sentenced to this witch's brew of fear and danger and violence and disorder, over-policing, under-protection, and broken relationships between the state and the people who need state protection the most. And we have been living with this as if it's normal. And the world, the country in the last 2 years has suddenly decided that this is not okay. And it's not okay, and we can do better, and we can only do better if the center of gravity insists on it, and I actually think that that's happening.
Ken?
In November, a 9-year-old boy in Chicago named Tayshawn Lee was playing on a swing, middle of the day. He was lured into an alley by gang members and executed in broad daylight at the age of 9 and killed. We need to look at those killings like that and say, this is insane. Not here, not in our country. In Brooklyn, a 1-year-old baby was shot and killed in Brownsville because someone was trying to shoot his father. These lives matter. They may be poor black boys and black men, but they're Americans. And they're our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our neighbors. And we need to slow it down.
This is a sacred place. This is a sacred moment. The exploration of justice in Plato's time was very, very tangible, even though we understand Plato's search for justice to be some sort of abstract philosophical inquiry. In fact, it was deeply rooted in what is real in the world. Just as my children ask me, what is justice in America, Dad and Mom? And I have such a difficult time answering that question. I used to do classic old-style film photography where you develop the image in a bath, and the image would suddenly come into focus in the fluid as you added the chemicals. And I think the discussion that we've been having today about justice produces an image of American history that we can never, ever forget. That we are a violent nation. That we are a nation who is still fighting the racial battles of 100 years ago. You see it in the faces in prison. You see it in the violence and the impulse to violence in law enforcement. We have to recognize that those battles don't just go away by sociology. We have to choose, every single one of us, white and black. The search for justice is that choosing. I thank Tina Brown for allowing me to come here and this terrific panel, and to all of you, thanks so much.
David, thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Possible attacks by ISIS supporters right here in the United States.
Why am I being frisked?
Well, long before Eric Holder was the highest-ranking law official in the nation, he was a trial judge in Washington. And he was known because he was such a tough sentencer then, as Hold'em Holder. But as more and more young black men passed through his court, he began to question the system and his role in it. He set out not to simply enforce policy, but to shape it. He blazed a meteoric and history-making trail as the first African-American to serve as U.S. Attorney General for the District of Columbia, Deputy Attorney General, and finally the first African-American Attorney General itself, where despite a first term consumed by national security challenges, he never lost sight of his desire to address the inequities in our criminal justice system. It's a great honor to welcome him today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. Well, tell us if you can, Eric, which you said I can call you, about your journey from Hold'em Holder as the judge in Washington to the man you became, so concerned with criminal justice reform. What were the things that tipped you into that direction?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think that my role as a judge was something that was very dispiriting. At the time that I was a judge in Washington, D.C., Washington was considered statistically the murder capital of the country. Huge problem with violence. And that, I think, is something that led to the Hold'em Holder thing. I had all these people in front of me who had committed violent crimes. But I also had people in front of me who were drug addicted and who were involved in the criminal justice system as a result of their drug problems. And I had an inability as a judge to deal with those issues other than to take them, sentence them, try them, sentence them, and then put them away in jail for what I thought were inordinately long periods of time. And I said to myself, you know, this is not who I want to be. And so 5 years into my time as a judge, I quit, became the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., with the hope that I might put in place policies that would be more fair, more just, and have better outcomes. And I brought that same spirit with me to my time as Deputy Attorney General and then ultimately as Attorney General.
Because it wasn't until President Obama's second term in office that you launched the Smart on Crime initiative to identify reforms. Why did you feel that the time was right in that second term that you could now go ahead and do certain things that you felt you couldn't in the first term?
Well, it wasn't as if we were doing nothing in the first term. I reversed the Ashcroft memo, for instance, in the first term that required all federal prosecutors to charge the maximum offense that you could prove, irrespective of what the conduct was at issue, and we changed that. The President and I have been talking about criminal justice reform for a good number of years. I think is what initially bonded the two of us when I first met him before, I guess right after he'd been elected to the Senate, but before he'd actually been sworn in. And it took time for us to work through things at the Justice Department, to have in place the things that I wanted to implement. And by January of the second term, beginning of the second term, I was ready to go. I was ready to roll.
You wrote a memo, I gather, which was, you were asked by the President what was the top of your agenda, and you said that reforming the justice system was the top of your agenda.
He asked me to lay out what did I think about a second term, both in terms of the entirety of the term and what did I want to do in the short term. And at the top of both of those sections was, we've got to do something about our criminal justice system.
Right. Well, of course, you also announced a very ambitious program to review the cases of literally thousands of non-violent offenders. Right. But so far, only 184 sentences have been commuted and 66 prisoners pardoned. It was meant to be much more ambitious than that. Why so few?
Yeah, and I think that is something that I would say that I'm disappointed in the number. I'd say the President's probably disappointed in the number as well. But let's not forget, the Obama presidency does not end today. There is still about a year or so to go. We're going to have a new pardon attorney. There are new processes that are being put in place in the Justice Department, in the White House counsel's office, where these things go. My expectation would be that you'll see a substantially greater number of people who will be the beneficiaries of the power that the President definitely wants to use. I mean, he's frustrated by the pace at which this has been going.
Well, of course, even if that does happen, though, it's not going to make that dramatic cut to the size of the country's prison population. You know, last year I visited Greaterford Prison, and I met so many offenders, who'd done hot-headed, stupid things when they were 17, 18, 19, and there they were, since 1971, sitting there in prison in their late 60s. So when is it going to happen that we actually think about grasping that third rail, which is to actually start to let out those offenders who were violent but no longer are violent?
Yeah, that's actually a critical question. In some ways, we've looked at the low-hanging fruit and talked about nonviolent drug offenders who got inordinately long sentences and who need to be out of jail, and everybody kind of agrees on that. But there's also the question of dealing with people who committed violent acts and who got really long sentences, some of which were deserved. I'm a prosecutor at heart, and some people need to be in jail for really extended periods of time. On the other hand, there are people who make mistakes, and there are people who go to prison and rehabilitate themselves or have the ability to become rehabilitated. And that has to be a part of our criminal justice system, an individualized determination about where this person is. Is this person going to be a threat if he or she is released? And we've got to put in place mechanisms to maximize the possibility that more of those people can be changed. I mean, our system now deals with people who have all of these social deficits. They commit crimes, they go into the system, they're not rehabilitated, and then we put them back in the same environments from which they came, and we expect a different result, which is illogical. And we are shocked by the recidivism rates that we have. So we need to devote more attention, more resources to these issues. And we have to also understand that we do things in the United States that no other country does. We incarcerate more of our people at greater rates than any other country in the world. I'm sure you've heard this during the course of this day, but we're 5% of the world's population. 25% of all the prisoners in the world are here in the United States. About 700 per 100,000 of our people are in jail. The closest to that is that great civil libertarian and civil liberties country, Russia, and they're at about 400. We have more prisoners than China does. So
it's really mind-blowing. Of course, to go to prison in the first place, you have to get arrested. So we've talked a lot today about police conduct and about how policing has the fraying between the African American communities and the police. After riots erupted in Ferguson, you went there, I know. What did you learn there that you didn't know before, perhaps, because you've studied this stuff for so many years about what was happening and about the relationships between the police and Black America?
I think that what struck me about Ferguson was the uniform negative view that people had in that community, black and white, about law enforcement. It was striking not to have here almost any defenders of law enforcement in Ferguson. And then when we did that study that I called a searing study of the Ferguson law enforcement community and found out what it is they were doing, which was essentially to run the government, fund the government by arresting people for minor offenses, traffic offenses very often, getting them ensnared in payments, non-payments, warrants for arrests. It became clear to me why there was that negative feeling. And it unfortunately, it is unfortunately, I think, that's an extreme example, but there is definitely the need for us to identify the problems that exist between communities of color and law enforcement. And we have to face some hard truths. We have to also face some tough history. The criminal justice system in the past has been used as a means of social control. And without that recognition and without the recognition of all that has engendered in communities of color, we're never going to get to a place where we need to be. And I think we can get to that place, but we have to be honest about both the history that we've endured and the present that we must still confront.
Have you ever experienced racial profiling yourself?
Sure. I'm a black man. Yeah. And I say that not to elicit laughter, but that is a reality. My classic story is that I was running in Georgetown, and if you know Washington, D.C., it's a nice part of D.C., to get to a movie. It was late at night with my cousin, and we were running, and so police officers come by in a car, shine a light on us. Halt, what are you doing? Now, I have the presence of mind to know, all right, I'm just running to go to a movie. These police officers, I'm not gonna. My cousin, by contrast, starts mouthing off. And I'm thinking, man, whoa, let's not do that. Anyway, it gets resolved. Now, the only thing I was guilty of was being black and running to a movie in a predominantly white part of Washington, D.C. The interesting thing was, at the time of the stop, I was a federal prosecutor. I was an employee of a thing called the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division of the United States Department of Justice. And, it was brought home to me in a very stark way. You can be a whole bunch of things, but in the eyes of at least those two police officers, I was a black guy in a place where I shouldn't have been, doing something that was suspicious, and that was running.
Right. Incredibly sobering. Well, of course, the march from Montgomery to Selma for voting rights was just over 50 years ago. I mean, considering the vigorous campaign to institute voter ID laws across the country and the Supreme Court's recent, of course, decision to gut the Voting Rights Act, do you think that we could be going backwards in America?
I fear that unless people of goodwill mobilize, I think that we can go back. These voter ID laws are really an attempt to retard the growth of, let's be honest, the Obama coalition, which is very scary to some people. This is a country that is in the throes of demographic changes, the likes of which we have not seen. This country is going to be more brown in 2040, 2050. There'll be no majority race. 2043, I think, is the latest statistic. The coming diversity can be a source of great strength for this nation, or it can be a source of great divisiveness. Those who have come up with these new voter ID laws based on this notion of voter fraud, which statistically does not exist, it's really an attempt to keep in place the status quo. It's an attempt to not let new people with new ideas, new thoughts emerge, and to keep in place a system that has been in place for an extended period of time. It's interesting to me that you see these voter ID laws only in those places where you have Republican governors and Republican legislatures. And I think the reality is that they can't win the game, so they're going to try to change the rules of the game.
No, it's absolutely driven by fear,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, this morning we had U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara with us, and he had something to say that he said we should ask you. So let's just roll that clip if it has.
6.5 years ago, that he called me in November of 2009 and said that your office will be prosecuting Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And then obviously for reasons that you describe and other reasons, that didn't end up happening, and he remains in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. In those 6.5 years, my office and the great career prosecutors in my office with the Joint Terrorism Task Force have convicted terrorist after terrorist after terrorist, including Osama bin Laden's son-in-law and a whole host of other people who were involved in acts of tremendous violence, killing Americans over and over and over again, while I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is awaiting his first pretrial conference or something like that.
Yeah. So, were you mad about that?
I was mad then, I'm mad now, and I'm not a person, I don't think, of great ego, but I was damn right, and the people who opposed me were damn wrong. And if Preet and I and Neil McBride, who was the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, if we had been allowed to do that which we said was appropriate, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his Confederates would be on death row right now instead of waiting for their first pretrial hearing. The opposition to what we wanted to do was political in nature. I will say that at least one senator I have a great deal of respect for, Lindsey Graham, and he and I interacted about that, and I think he was coming from a different place. He had different views and different solutions.
He had great respect for military courts because he had served on them, I think.
Yeah, and that was right. But others, the mantra was, you want to hold or you want to give rights to these people, the same rights that you would give to ordinary American citizens. And for the life of me, I thought to myself, what the hell does that mean? I want to put people in the best criminal justice system in the world, give them a fair opportunity to raise whatever they want in terms of defenses, and then hold them accountable. And plus, I want to do it here. I want to do it here in New York City where the offenses actually occurred. And everybody was with us for a while, and then people started to find jelly in their spines, not only at the federal level, but at the local level as well. And I think that the fact that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is still sitting in Guantanamo, essentially thumbing his nose at the American people, is a great testament to what happens when politicians decide to become involved in the criminal justice system.
Wow, okay, now tell me what you really think.
Right. You didn't ask me to name names.
Yeah,
I was ready to do that,
too.
too.
Okay, go. I was going to say, my next question, Eric, was, who do you blame for this miscarriage of justice?
Well, I will say that at least one Republican senator indicated that the greatest response that she got in her reelection effort was to say that, this Bolshevik Holder wants to put these people in our criminal justice system and give them more rights than, or give them the same rights than any American citizen would have. And a number of senators said, yeah, I get it. That's a good applause line for me. But as I said, Lindsey Graham, again, different views, but coming from a good place. John McCain, I would say the same thing. Others, Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire. I think that her opposition was political in nature.
Yeah.
And she's got to face the voters this time in New Hampshire, and I hope that the people in New Hampshire will ask her that question.
Well, listen, the whole Gitmo thing, of course, continues to fester, and, you wanted to close it, we know that. Here we are talking about our justice system and all the things we want to reform it, but isn't, Guantanamo Bay just a black hole, a terrible, offense against anyone who believes in justice?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
The president asked me to begin the process of closing Guantanamo, and what we did was bring together people from the defense community, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, and for the first time, look at all of the prisoners who were there and come up with an individual file on each one of them so that we can make recommendations as to what should happen to them. Some should be released, taken to third countries. Some should be tried. Congress, again, in its infinite wisdom, put in a series of roadblocks and attached those roadblocks to the National Defense Authorization Act so that the president was faced with the prospect of either authorizing the funds to fund our Army, Navy, Air Force, or veto the whole bill, which contained these poison pills about Guantanamo. In spite of that, the number is now below 100 or so. I'm not optimistic that the number will be reduced to zero by the end of this president's term, but it is not, I think it's wrong to say that Barack Obama failed as much as Congress, again, got in the way and for political reasons.
Well, Hillary Clinton, I know, was very exercised about this, and she said that she told White House aides at the time that throwing the president's commitment to close Guantanamo into the trash can was really unacceptable. Do you think that a Clinton administration, a Hillary Clinton administration, might be able to get it done?
Yeah, I think that over time, the mood has changed, and I think that it really will take just more time. I don't think this president has enough time, but I think another president who might succeed him and who's of the same view, that Guantanamo serves as a recruiting tool for those who would do harm to us, that it's a blight. You know, we have people who have been held there 15 years, 13 years or so, and who this committee that I put together has made the determination they can be safely released. They can be put in other countries. That we're holding these people. This is inconsistent with who we say we are as a people. A right-thinking president, I think, can successfully close Guantanamo.
Well, you've said that the worst day of your tenure as Attorney General was the day that you visited Sandy Hook, after the terrible massacre. And of course, we just heard that fascinating and very, very enlightening and moving at times conversation about guns. But you were shut down on guns really early in the Obama administration when you said that reinstating the assault rifle ban was a White House priority. According to Dan Kleibman in his book, Kill or Capture, Rahm Emanuel sent a message to the DOI saying, shut the fuck up about guns, okay? Excuse the profanity.
Rahm used an F word? That's very atypical of him.
Very atypical. So do you think that the administration, should have pushed more aggressively in the first term about guns? I mean, was this another example of politics getting in the way of doing the right thing?
I'm not sure it's politics getting in the way of doing the right thing, but I do think that, in retrospect, we should have pushed harder. And we certainly did push hard after the massacre at Newtown in Sandy Hook. And I thought, sure, having been there on what was the worst day of my time as Attorney General, that the American people, the people who represent the American people, would have said, this is too much, babies, 6-year-olds, massacred in their classrooms. And I think that if people had seen what I saw that day, these grizzled first responders, crime scene search officers literally crying, seeing the classrooms with the little posters that kids put up, what I plan to do this year in first grade, with the letters that are sometimes turned around, it looked very cute. And you saw the blood, along the bottoms of the walls, blood-spattered bathroom. If the American people had seen those pictures, even the cowards in our Congress would have been forced to do the right thing.
Yeah, but they didn't. Okay, so were you frustrated in office by, these sheer, the cowardice that you mentioned a lot? I mean, you accomplished a lot, obviously, a huge amount in your 8 years, but would you say that was the major thing that was troublesome to you?
I think that's my biggest failure as Attorney General, the inability to put in place reasonable gun safety measures, especially in light of the mass shootings that we saw all the time that I was Attorney General, and in particular, what happened at Sandy Hook. I worked very hard with Vice President Biden, met with really substantial numbers of people who were of the pro-gun community and who turned out to be extremely reasonable and who raised issues that frankly I had not thought about transfer of guns between family members that happen in rural settings, and you want to have people do this with some kind of interaction with the government. Well, there is no government, near us in Montana or something like that. All right, something we could try to work our way through. But the inability to pass, Toomey Mansion, I mean, it is, from my perspective, a failure. That's a failure.
Well, you don't have those kind of constraints anymore. You're now back in private practice. What's going to be the focus for the rest of your career? And are you going to be able to stay focused on some of these questions that we've talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, as I said when I announced my resignation at the White House, I'm leaving my job as Attorney General of the United States, but I'm never going to leave the work. The fight for equality, the fight for voting rights, the fight for a more just criminal justice system. These are the kinds of things that animated my professional life and will continue to animate my life post-government. And I hope it'll be the kind of thing that will animate everybody's lives. I mean, if we want an America that is true to its founding documents, it's incumbent upon all of us to demand that from those who we elect. And one thing I think the president said, if we talk about just the gun issue, we have to start thinking about making that a one-issue thing for us as we assess candidates. Where do you stand on gun safety measures? And if people are, half-stepping or not strong in the way that they should be, they should not get our votes, and because the reality is that on the other side, people have all these concerns about foreign policy, economic stuff, but they list as number one the whole question of what their representatives, how their representatives will vote when it comes to gun issues. Now, I don't say we have to make it number one and to the exclusion of all else. We certainly have to raise it in our consideration of who we are going to cast our votes for. And the reality is, the American people support these gun safety measures by, really substantial margins. Even people who are members of the NRA support these gun safety measures. And so it is time for the American people to raise their voices, use their ballots, fight for good voter laws and protect the right to vote, but then use that power for change. And we shouldn't get awfully concerned about the money that exists out there. This Republican primary thing that we're watching is a good example. Jeb Bush has more money than I think anybody, and he's at like 4 or 5%. Donald Trump, he's a lot of things. He spent little or no money, and he gets all this free media, whatever. And he's by far number one. So the fact that the other side might have great deals of money can't stand up to what we can do as citizens with the ballot.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric Holder. It has been a huge pleasure to talk to you today. And thank you for everything you've done.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Eric.
Jeremy?
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. Jeremy
Good.
is going to now do his swan song. Thank you very much, everybody. We're closing the American Justice Summit now, and of course, President Travis has things to say. Thank you so much. Eric, you can slip away.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric. So a few short thank yous and short personal reflections. Thank you, first of all, to my partner in this effort, the brilliant, passionate, unstoppable Tina Brown. Thank you, Tina. We are all in your debt for giving urgency and energy to this conversation. And here at John Jay, I just have to thank staff of mine who have worked on this, Bettina Munster, Dan Stageman, Lisa Galloway-Perry, the theater staff, the facilities staff, faculty and students. We feel energized by the summit being here in our home. But the deepest thanks are really to you and to those of you who are not here but are here in spirit. We include, of course, the brave pioneers who shared their stories on this stage. We include the families who lost loved ones and have been victims of crime who have now lent their voices to the cause of justice. We thank the police officers, the lawyers, the corrections officials, the judges, and other public servants who do the really, truly hard work of protecting us, sometimes at personal peril, and providing for justice. And finally, as an educator, I have to thank the young people. We do think long-term here, and here across the country, there are many who have embraced this cause and know that their country, they know in their gut that their country can do better, in fact, much better. So they all inspire us and give us reasons for optimism. So I just want to say in reflection that we chose the title of this as the American Justice Summit for a reason. we wanted to use this opportunity to reflect on this experiment in democracy. We have to answer some pretty profound questions about the future of our country. Can we ensure domestic tranquility? How do we hold people accountable? How do we limit and guide the power of the state? How do we help those who enforce the law fairly and without doing damage? When we must detain somebody, hold them in a prison for appropriate reasons, what do we expect to happen there? What do we expect to happen when they return home? These are profound questions in our democracy, made difficult by our history of how we have, as a country, dealt with issues of slavery and the treatment of those of African descent, how we as a country have dealt with the indigenous peoples who preceded Europeans coming here, how we as a country have dealt with immigrants who have come to our shores to seek economic well-being, security, and found themselves, in fact, excluded and shunned. So the last 50 years we have, many of us would say, gone off course from the promise of our democracy in ways that we now know, and is sort of part of our catechism, that we have become much more punitive. Many more people in prison, probation, parole, children. This we all know. But this is a time as we leave the summit to think about the future of our democracy. As we look at this through the lens of history, the lens of race, the lens of poverty, the lens of justice, we're really asking, what is justice in America? What is the American Justice Summit? What is it we want to see happen for racial justice, economic justice, justice for victims, justice for women, justice for those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder? And can our justice system be an instrument of justice rather than an instrument of injustice? These are deep questions. So as we leave here, we were just given almost a spiritual sort of benediction by the panel right before this one with the Attorney General to think really about deep questions about us, about our conscience, about what's right, about what's ethical, and about our country. But I think the overarching emotion today is one of optimism. That's what's come across the stage to me. And it's an optimism that comes from the bipartisan consensus that Tina mentioned at the outset, that many people reference. It's the optimism that comes from these stories. It's the optimism, the sense that we're at a tipping point, that something different is happening in our country. So it's time for us to reclaim the cause of justice in America. So now is the moment. Now is the time. Now is our time. The momentum for reform has never been stronger. We have not seen it in our lifetime when there's so much possible. But what that means is that we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do. So as you leave here, I hope you'll join everybody who's committed to this cause, to me, my colleagues, to Tina and her colleagues, and reaffirm your commitment to doing the hard work on behalf of our country. Thanks so much.
An inspired leader. I hope you can hear. Is this gone off now, or is this okay? Yes, well, Jeremy, thank you for your inspired leadership of John Jay. You have done so much personal work and so much incredible intellectual contribution to the issues that we've been talking about today. It's wonderful to partner with you. And there are so many generous, talented people and organizations that came together to make this summit what it was. First of all, I do want to thank the incredible people who told their stories on our stage. I mean, the moving stories of relatives and mothers and sisters, siblings, and people who have had incredible losses, and they brought their brave energy to the stage to try to make sure these tragedies don't happen to anybody else was quite remarkable. And back there in the green room, I saw so many wonderful moments as they connected with one another. It was quite extraordinary back there. First of all, of course, thank you for the visionary support of the Ford Foundation, who've played such a role today, and Darren Walker, of course, did his wonderful interview with Usher, for supporting sponsor Thomson Reuters, a knowledge partner, Just Leadership USA, and media partners, the Marshall Project, who are doing such incredible pioneer work in this space, Vice News, who live-streamed us today, and WNYC, whose coverage of the justice system has been justifiably recognized with so many plaudits. And of course, I want to acknowledge the American Justice team on my side that has given their all to make the summit what it is today. First of all, our exceptionally talented executive producer, Anna Hall, who brought so much creativity and dedication to this project, and our distinguished director, Gregory Mosher, who is such an enormous pleasure to work with. The American Justice Summit is the work of passionate journalists, producers, coordinators, and I'm so pleased and proud to call them my colleagues and collaborators, as I am to the tireless team at John Jay who joined forces with us. Let's please give them all another round of applause. As Brian Stevenson has memorably said, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. So now all of you, I hope, who leave this theater today, as Jeremy has said, let's keep hope alive through the tenacity of our actions and the intelligence of our approach as we strive to make good on the great American ideal of justice for all. Thank you so much.